Tonight, we talk about the wolves. Not the noble kind, not the wolves of heraldry and fairy tales, the dignified predators that artists paint standing on mountaintops with the wind in their fur and wisdom in their eyes. Those wolves are symbols. Metaphors, comfortable lies that civilized societies tell about a creature they have never actually met. The wolves we are talking about tonight are the other kind. The kind that hunt in the dark, that move through blizzards that would kill anything else alive, that tear their prey apart not with elegance but with efficiency, with teeth and claws and the patient, savage endurance of predators who have learned that survival is not given but taken, one kill at a time, in a universe that does not care whether you live or die. The Space Wolves, the Sixth Legion, the Velka Fenriker, the Wolves of Fenris in the language of the death world that made them. The Emperor's executioners, his attack dogs, his instruments of punishment, the warriors he unleashed when a problem required not a scalpel but a jaw full of teeth. They are the Imperium's most savage chapter. This is not an insult. This is a job description. The Space Wolves were designed to be savage, recruited from savage stock, trained by savage methods, and deployed on missions that required savagery, because the alternative, subtlety, diplomacy, the measured application of calibrated force had already failed or had never been appropriate in the first place. They are also the Imperium's most loyal. This is the contradiction that makes the Space Wolves interesting. The most feral, the most undisciplined, the most stubbornly independent chapter in the Adeptus Astartes is also the chapter that has never, in 10,000 years of service, wavered in its loyalty to the Emperor. Not to the Imperium's institutions. Not to the High Lords. Not to the Inquisition, the Administratum, or any of the bureaucratic machinery that has accumulated around the Emperor's original vision like barnacles on a warship's hull. To the Emperor. The man. The father. The figure who earned Lehman Russ's loyalty 10,000 years ago through the simple expedient of being the only being in the galaxy who could beat the Wolf King in a fight. The Space Wolves' understanding of the Emperor is different from that of every other chapter. The Space Wolves do not worship the Emperor. They do not view the master of mankind as a god, as the ecclesiarchy demands, or as a divine figure whose will must be interpreted by mortal intermediaries. The Space Wolves view the Emperor as a father, a leader, the alpha of the pack. The distinction is fundamental. A god is served through worship, through ritual, through the institutional apparatus of organized religion. A father is served through loyalty, through action, through the personal bond that exists between parent and child. The Space Wolves' relationship with the Emperor is the latter, personal, direct, unmediated by the institutional structures that other chapters and the broader Imperium place between themselves and the master of mankind. Russ knew the Emperor. Russ ate with the Emperor, drank with the Emperor, fought beside the Emperor. The Emperor was not an abstraction for Russ. The Emperor was a person, a being whose strength and whose authority Russ had tested and acknowledged. And the acknowledgement, rooted in direct experience rather than in institutional teaching, produced a loyalty that no institutional argument can replicate. The Space Wolves carry this loyalty. 10,000 years after Russ met the Emperor on the ice of Fenris, the chapter's warriors feel the bond that their Primarch established, the genetic memory of the Alpha's presence sustaining a loyalty that transcends the institutional apparatus that the broader Imperium has constructed. When the Space Wolves say that they serve the Emperor, they mean it differently from how other chapters mean it. Other chapters serve the Emperor's institution. The Space Wolves serve the Emperor's person. The Emperor who walked among men, the Emperor who fought. The Emperor who earned the right to lead through the demonstration of superior strength that Fenrisian culture recognizes as the only legitimate basis for authority. The loyalty is personal. The loyalty is absolute. The loyalty is the thing that the Imperium's administrators find simultaneously reassuring and terrifying, because a chapter that is loyal to the Emperor is a chapter that may not be loyal to the Emperor's servants, and the distinction between the two loyalties is the gap through which 10,000 years of institutional conflict has poured. The Space Wolves are the only chapter in the Adeptus Astartes that has maintained a continuous cultural tradition stretching back to the Primarch's own era. Other chapters have evolved, their cultures shaped by the Codex Astartes and by the institutional pressures of the broader Imperium. The Space Wolves have resisted this evolution, maintaining the Fenrisian warrior culture that Russ established with a stubbornness that the other chapters find both admirable and infuriating. The chapter drinks alcohol. This seems like a trivial detail, but it is significant in the context of the Adeptus Astartes. Most Space Marine chapters do not engage in recreational drinking. The Space Marine metabolism, modified by the Primarch's gene seed, processes alcohol differently from mortal physiology, and most chapters view the consumption of alcohol as a pointless indulgence in a warrior culture that values discipline above pleasure. The Space Wolves drink mead. They brew it themselves in the Fang's cavernous brewing halls, using recipes that have been refined over 10,000 years. They drink it in celebrations, in mourning, in the telling of sagas, and in the quiet moments between campaigns when the warriors gather in the Great Hall and share the companionship that the pack provides. The drinking is not indulgence. The drinking is communion. The shared cup is the shared bond, the mead flowing between warriors who have fought together and who will fight together again. The liquid carrying the warmth that the Fenrisian climate denies and that the Fenrisian culture provides. The Space Wolves also keep animals. The Fenrisian wolves that accompany some warriors into battle, the thunder wolves that carry the cavalry, the creatures that populate the Fang's lower levels and that the warriors treat as packmates rather than as pets, are a feature of the chapter's culture that has no parallel in other Space Marine forces. The animals are not mascots, they are members of the pack. The wolves that accompany a space wolf into battle fight alongside the warrior, their instincts coordinated with the warrior's tactics. Their presence on the battlefield, a reminder that the Space Wolves' bond with the Wolves of Fenris is not merely symbolic but functional. The Space Wolves do not play well with others. They do not follow rules they consider stupid. They do not respect authority they consider illegitimate. They do not submit to oversight they consider unnecessary. They are, by the standards of the Codex Astartes, the doctrinal manual that governs the organisation and conduct of every other Space Marine chapter, a disaster. A chapter that refuses to reorganise itself according to the Codex's prescriptions, that maintains a structure based on Fenrisian tribal traditions rather than on the standardised template that Roboute Guilliman designed to prevent any single chapter from becoming powerful enough to threaten the Imperium. The Codex exists because of the heresy, because Horus, with his legions, proved that Space Marines could turn against the Imperium and that the concentrated power of an entire legion under a single commander was too dangerous to allow. The Codex broke the legions into chapters, limiting each to 1,000 warriors, ensuring that no single chapter could wield the force that a full legion had commanded. The Space Wolves agreed. In theory. In practice, the Space Wolves organised themselves as they always had, in great companies led by wolf lords, in a structure that resembles the Codex's prescriptions the way a wolf resembles a dog. The basic shape is similar, but the temperament is fundamentally different. This is their story. A story of wolves and warriors, of loyalty and savagery, of a chapter that has spent 10,000 years doing exactly what the Emperor built them to do: fight the things that needed fighting, protect the people who needed protecting, and tell anyone who tried to stop them exactly where they could put their objections. It begins on Fenris. It always begins on Fenris. Fenris is a death world. This is not a classification that the Administratum assigns lightly. A death world is a planet where the environment itself is hostile to human life, where the ecosystem has produced conditions that make survival a constant, grinding, never-ending struggle against forces that are actively trying to kill you. Fenris does not merely qualify for the classification. Fenris defines it. The planet's orbit is wildly eccentric, swinging between extreme proximity to its sun and extreme distance, producing seasons that are less seasonal variations and more apocalyptic climate shifts. The summers are volcanic. The planet's tectonic activity, driven by the gravitational stresses of its orbit, produces eruptions that reshape the landscape, splitting continents, raising new islands from the seabed, and destroying old ones in cataclysms of fire and ash. The winters are frozen. The temperature drops to levels that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The seas freeze solid, and the blizzards that sweep across the planet's surface are so intense that they can bury entire settlements in hours. The wildlife is proportional to the planet's hostility. Fenris produces predators that are, by the standards of the galaxy's other death worlds, extraordinary. The Fenrisian wolves, the massive, intelligent, lupine predators that give the planet its character, are the most famous, but the ecology extends far beyond the wolves. Sea serpents, kraken, ice trolls, thunder wolves, creatures whose size and ferocity reflect the environment that produced them. An environment where anything that is not large enough, fast enough, or vicious enough to survive the planet's extremes does not survive at all. The seasons produce a rhythm of existence that shapes every aspect of Fenrisian life. During the brief summers, the tribes expand, colonizing new land, building settlements on islands that the volcanic activity has raised from the sea. During the winters, the tribes contract, retreating to the most defensible positions, huddling around fires that are the only barrier between the tribe and the killing cold. The cycle of expansion and contraction produces a culture that is intimately familiar with loss. The Fenrisians lose territory every winter, lose settlements to the seas every season, lose people to the predators and the climate and the volcanic activity that reshape their world on a scale that no human effort can resist. The losses produce a philosophy that the Space Wolves have absorbed into their own culture. Do not cling. Do not build anything you are not willing to lose. Do not love anything you cannot let go of, because the universe will take it, and the universe does not care about your grief. The philosophy produces warriors who are extraordinarily resilient to the psychological trauma that combat produces. A Fenrisian who has lost their home to the sea, their family to the winter, their tribe to the wars that the planet's seasons demand, is a Fenrisian who has already experienced the worst that loss can offer, and the losses that warfare produces, however terrible, are survivable for a warrior who has been taught, from birth, that loss is the natural state of existence. The human population of Fenris lives in this environment and does not merely endure it, but thrives in it. After a fashion, the Fenrisians are a warrior culture, tribal, hardy, organised around clans that compete for territory and resources, with a ferocity that mirrors the competition of the predators that share their world. The tribes fight each other. They fight the beasts, they fight the weather, the seas, the volcanic eruptions, and the frozen winters that threaten to extinguish them every year. The fighting produces warriors. The warriors who survive, who prove their strength and their cunning in the endless cycle of tribal warfare and environmental catastrophe, are the raw material from which the Space Wolves are made. The Fenrisian wolves deserve extended discussion, because they are not merely animals. The wolves of Fenris are intelligent, significantly more so than the wolves of Old Earth, and their intelligence produces pack dynamics that mirror the social structures of the space wolves themselves. The alpha of a Fenrisian wolf pack leads through demonstrated strength and through the pack's recognition of the alpha's ability to ensure the pack's survival, and the parallel between the wolf pack's hierarchy and the space wolves' hierarchy is not coincidental. There is a persistent theory within the Inquisition that the wolves of Fenris are not wolves at all. The theory, associated with the phrase "there are no wolves on Fenris," suggests that the planet's lupine predators are actually descendants of human colonists who were mutated by the warp's influence. Their human DNA, transformed by millennia of exposure to the Fenrisian environment and the warp energies that permeate the planet. If this theory is correct, the implications are profound. The thunder wolves that the space wolves ride into battle, the Fenrisian wolves that accompany the warriors in some great companies, the she-wolf that raised Daemon Prince himself, may be genetically human, their lupine appearance and behaviour the product of a mutation that has been operating for thousands of years. The space wolves do not acknowledge this theory. The chapter's reaction to the suggestion that their wolves are mutated humans ranges from dismissal to hostility, and the Inquisition has learned through painful experience that pressing the point is counterproductive. The recruitment process reflects Fenris's warrior culture. The chapter's wolf priests observe the planet's tribal wars, identifying young warriors whose courage, aggression, and physical capabilities mark them as potential aspirants. The selection is not gentle. The aspirants are not informed of their candidacy. They are taken, usually from the aftermath of tribal battles, their battered bodies collected by the wolf priests and transported to the Fang, where the transformation from mortal to space marine begins. The aspirants who survive the initial modifications face the trial of Morkai, the final test that determines whether the aspirant can master the Canis Helix's influence, or whether the Helix will overwhelm the aspirant's humanity and produce a wolfen. The trial sends the aspirant into the Fenrisian wilderness, alone, armed with nothing, forced to survive in an environment that kills the unprepared. The trial is not merely a test of survival. The trial is a psychic ordeal, the Canis Helix's influence flooding the aspirant's consciousness with bestial impulses that threaten to overwhelm the aspirant's rational mind. The aspirant must master the beast. They must acknowledge the wolf within, accept its presence, and impose their human will on the lupine instincts that the Helix is trying to unleash. Those who succeed become blood claws. Those who fail become wolfen, their humanity consumed by the transformation, their bodies reshaped into the bestial forms that the Canis Helix's unchecked influence produces. The mortality rate is not discussed. The number of aspirants who die during the process, who are killed by the wilderness, who are destroyed by the Canis Helix's influence before the wolfen transformation can even begin, is a number that the chapter does not share with outsiders. Fenris has been the Space Wolves' homeworld since Daemon Prince claimed it, and the chapter has maintained the planet in its Deathworld state deliberately, refusing to allow the kind of terraforming or technological development that would soften the environment and produce a population less suited to the chapter's needs. The harshness is the point. The Deathworld is the crucible. The tribes are the ore. The Space Wolves are the steel. Daemon Prince arrived on Fenris the way all Primarchs arrived on their homeworlds, falling from the sky, an infant demigod, deposited by the warp's currents on a world that would shape him into the warrior the Emperor needed him to be. The infant Russ landed in the mountains. The cold should have killed him. The exposure should have killed him. The predators that populated the mountainside should have killed him. Nothing killed him, because the Primarchs were not designed to be killed by the things that kill ordinary beings. And the infant Russ survived the landing, survived the cold, and survived the encounter with the Fenrisian she-wolf who found him, not by fighting her but by being adopted by her. The she-wolf raised Russ alongside her own cubs. The Primarch grew among wolves, learning the pack's hierarchy, the pack's hunting methods, the pack's language of growls and postures, and the subtle, instinctive communication that predators use to coordinate without words. Russ did not learn to be human among the wolves. He learned to be a wolf. King Thengir found the wild boy. The ruler of one of Fenris's most powerful tribes, Thengir recognized in the feral youth something that transcended ordinary wildness. A strength, an intelligence, a capacity for leadership that the boy's bestial upbringing had not destroyed, but had merely overlaid with a veneer of savagery. Thengir took the boy into his court. He gave the boy a name, Leman of the Russ. He taught the boy language, culture, the rudiments of civilization that the wolves had not provided. Russ learned quickly. The Primarch's superhuman intelligence, designed by the Emperor to absorb and process information at a rate that no ordinary human could match, adapted to human civilization with the same ease that it had adapted to wolf society. Russ learned to speak, to think in abstract terms, to understand the political and social dynamics of the tribe. He learned to fight with weapons rather than with teeth and claws, though he never abandoned the lessons that the wolves had taught him, and the combination of lupine instinct and human technique produced a warrior whose combat abilities exceeded anything that Fenris had seen. Russ became king. After Thengir's death, the young Primarch assumed leadership of the tribe and then, through a combination of martial prowess, political cunning, and the sheer overwhelming charisma that the Primarchs projected, united the warring tribes of Fenris under a single banner: the Wolf King. The ruler of a world that had never been ruled, the unifier of a people who had never been unified, the leader whose authority was earned through the oldest and most Fenrisian of methods, being better at fighting than everyone else. The Emperor came to Fenris, the master of mankind, on his great crusade to unite the scattered worlds of humanity under a single banner, arrived on the Death World and sought out the warrior king whose legend had reached even the Emperor's ears. The meeting between Russ and the Emperor is the founding myth of the Space Wolves, the origin story that the chapter has retold for 10,000 years, and that encapsulates everything the chapter believes about the nature of authority, loyalty, and the bond between leader and follower. The sagas describe the Emperor's arrival on Fenris as the arrival of a stranger, a being of extraordinary presence who walked into the Wolf King's hall without invitation and without the deference that every other visitor to the court displayed. The stranger radiated power, a presence that the warriors in the hall felt as a physical force, a pressure that made the air heavy and that silenced the boasting and the laughter that normally filled the mead hall. Russ challenged the stranger. The Wolf King, who had never encountered a being whose presence exceeded his own, was intrigued rather than intimidated, and the challenge was the natural response of a Fenrisian king whose authority was maintained through demonstrated strength. The eating contest came first. The tables were loaded with the products of Fenris's harsh ecology: roasted kraken, smoked wolf meat, sea serpent steaks, and the heavy, dense bread that Fenrisian bakers produced from the grain that grew during the planet's brief summer. Russ ate with the focused intensity of a Primarch whose metabolism could process nutrients at a rate that would have killed a normal human, and the stranger matched him, course for course, plate for plate, the two consuming enough food to feed a warband. The drinking followed. The mead of Fenris, a potent beverage brewed from the honey of insects that survived the planet's volcanic summers, was brought in barrels, and Russ and the stranger drank with the same competitive intensity that they had eaten, emptying barrel after barrel while the hall's warriors watched with the fascination of spectators at a contest whose outcome nobody could predict. Russ won both contests. The Wolf King consumed more, drank more, demonstrated a capacity for excess that the stranger could not quite match, and the victories produced a confidence in the young Primarch that the stranger had been cultivating. The fighting was the final contest, and the fighting was different. The stranger did not simply match Russ blow for blow. As the stranger had matched him bite for bite and drink for drink, the stranger surpassed him. The Emperor's blow was not merely powerful, it was absolute, a strike that carried the weight of a being whose power exceeded anything that Fenris had produced, and the strike dropped Russ to the ground for the first and only time in the Wolf King's life. Russ understood. The instinct that had guided the Primarch through every challenge that Fenris had presented, the Predator's ability to recognize a superior force, told Russ that the being who stood over him was not merely stronger. The being was the Alpha. The being was the leader that Russ's nature required him to follow. Russ knelt. And, in the kneeling, in the submission that was not weakness, but recognition, the Space Wolves were born. The meeting is the subject of Fenrisian saga, and the saga has been embellished over 10,000 years of retelling, but the core events are consistent across the versions. The Emperor challenged Russ to 3 contests: eating, drinking, and fighting. Russ won the first 2, consuming quantities of food and mead that exceeded what even a Primarch's metabolism should have been able to process. The third contest was combat. The Emperor struck Russ down. 1 blow. The first and only defeat that the Wolf King had ever suffered. The first and only being in the galaxy who had proven stronger than the Primarch, who had beaten every warrior, every beast, and every challenge that Fenris had produced. Russ knelt. Not in submission, in recognition. The Primarch understood, with the instinctive clarity that his wolf upbringing had given him, that the being who stood before him was the Alpha. The leader of the pack, the figure whose authority was earned through the same mechanism that Fenrisian culture recognized as legitimate superior strength. The 6th Legion before Russ was a force that the Imperium used with caution, and that the other legions viewed with unease. Recruited from Terra's most violent tribal populations, the Legion's early warriors were drawn from the same well of human savagery that the Emperor had been cultivating since the Unification Wars. Ice Tribe barbarians, Tundra raiders, feral warriors whose aggression the Emperor valued, but whose discipline he had not yet been able to fully impose. The pre-Russ 6th Legion fought with an effectiveness that was undermined by an unpredictability that made them difficult to deploy alongside other Imperial forces. The Legion's warriors were ferocious but unfocused, their aggression channeled through methods that owed more to their Terran tribal origins than to any formal military doctrine. The Emperor used them as shock troops, deploying them in situations where raw violence was sufficient and where the collateral damage that their lack of discipline produced was an acceptable cost. The reunion with Russ transformed the Legion. The Primarch's presence provided the focal point that the Legion's aggression needed, the Alpha whose authority organized the pack's energy into a coherent, purposeful force. The Fenrisian warriors who joined the Legion after Russ's discovery added a cultural dimension that the Terran-born warriors gradually adopted. The chapter's identity shifting from generic Imperial ferocity to the Fenrisian warrior culture that Russ embodied. The transformation was not instantaneous. The Terran veterans of the 6th Legion, warriors who had fought before Russ's arrival and who carried the culture of their pre-Fenrisian origins, clashed with the Fenrisian recruits, whose tribal traditions and whose relationship with their Primarch produced a fundamentally different martial identity. The clash resolved itself, as most clashes within the Space Wolves resolve themselves, through demonstrated prowess, through the natural selection of combat, and through the gravitational pull of Russ's personality, which drew every warrior in the Legion into the Fenrisian orbit, regardless of their origins. By the time the Great Crusade was in full stride, the 6th Legion was Fenrisian in everything but the bloodlines of its oldest veterans. The Space Wolves were born. The Emperor gave Russ command of the 6th Legion, the Space Marines whose gene seed had been crafted from the Primarch's own genetic material. The Legion had been fighting without their Primarch, operating as a savage, barely controlled force whose aggression and effectiveness were matched by their difficulty in working alongside other Imperial forces. The Legion's culture reflected its Terran origins. The early Space Wolves had been recruited from Terra's most violent tribes, warriors whose ferocity the Emperor had valued, but whose discipline he had not yet been able to impose. Russ imposed discipline, not the discipline of the Ultramarines, the standardized, codified, procedural discipline that Guilliman would later enshrine in his codex. Fenrisian discipline. Pack discipline, the discipline of a wolf pack, where every member knows its place, where the hierarchy is maintained through demonstrated strength, where loyalty is absolute within the pack and where the pack's interests override everything else. The 6th Legion became the Space Wolves, the Vilka Fenriker, and the Emperor gave them a role that no other Legion shared, the role of Executioner. The Executioner, the Enforcer. The Primarch, who was called when the Emperor needed a problem solved that could not be solved through negotiation, diplomacy, or the measured application of political pressure. When a compliance went wrong. When a planetary governor defied the Emperor's authority. When a situation required not the velvet glove but the iron fist, and not merely the iron fist, but the iron fist attached to an arm that was willing to swing it without hesitation, without mercy, and without the moral qualms that might slow a more reflective Primarch. Russ was the Emperor's weapon of last resort. The Emperor pointed, and Russ struck. And the striking was savage and thorough and final. The worlds that the Space Wolves pacified stayed pacified, not because the pacification was gentle, but because the pacification was absolute. The resistance crushed so completely that the will to resist was destroyed alongside the capacity to resist. The role carried implications that the law addresses only obliquely, through inference and suggestion rather than direct statement. The Emperor's executioner was the Primarch who was called upon when a legion or its Primarch had become too dangerous to be allowed to continue. The missing Primarchs, the 2nd and the 11th, the 2 brothers whose legions were expunged from Imperial records and whose names were erased from history, may have been Russ's work. The law does not confirm this. The law implies it, through the reactions of other Primarchs when the subject is raised, through the uncomfortable silences that follow references to the missing brothers, through the way that certain Primarchs look at Russ when the conversation turns to the question of what happened to the 2nd and the 11th. Russ may have killed his brothers. On the Emperor's orders, the executioner may have executed. The possibility hangs over the Space Wolves' history like a shadow, unconfirmed but impossible to dismiss, a darkness in the chapter's past that the chapter itself does not discuss, and that the Imperium's records have been systematically purged to conceal. If Russ did it, he did it because the Emperor told him to. If Russ did it, the act would have been carried out with the same grim, joyless efficiency that characterized the burning of Prospero. Not in rage, not in hatred, but in duty. The executioner does not hate the condemned. The executioner carries out the sentence. The weight of that duty, if the duty was performed, would explain much about Russ's character. The Wolf King's post-Prospero guilt, his growing doubt, his eventual departure into the Eye of Terror, may be the accumulated consequence of a lifetime spent carrying out sentences that the Primarch's conscience could not endlessly absorb. The role made the Space Wolves feared, not merely respected, in the way that all Space Marine legions were respected. Feared, the other legions understood what the Space Wolves were. They understood what the arrival of the Vilka Fenriker meant, that the Emperor had decided that the situation required the executioner's attention, and that the executioner's attention, once attracted, did not stop until the problem was resolved. The fear was deliberate. The Emperor wanted the Space Wolves to be feared, because fear is a weapon, and a weapon that prevents conflict through deterrence is more efficient than a weapon that resolves conflict through destruction. The Space Wolves' reputation, the knowledge that the Emperor had a legion that he would deploy without hesitation against anyone who defied his authority, prevented defiance in cases where the threat of the Space Wolves was sufficient to achieve compliance without the Space Wolves actually being deployed. When the deployment happened, it was decisive. The Space Wolves did not negotiate. The Space Wolves did not offer terms. The Space Wolves arrived, assessed the situation, and applied the solution that the situation required. And the solution was always the same overwhelming force, applied with the focused, purposeful savagery that the Wolves of Fenris applied to their prey. The role carried a cost. The other Primarchs viewed Russ with a mixture of respect and wariness that reflected their understanding of what the Wolf King represented. Russ was not merely a brother. He was the Emperor's enforcer, the Primarch who might one day be sent against them, and the knowledge that Russ was willing to carry out the Emperor's orders without question, even orders that required the destruction of a brother Primarch, created a distance between Russ and his siblings that no amount of fraternal affection could bridge. The distance was largest with Magnus, the Primarch of the Thousand Sons. The sorcerer, the seeker of forbidden knowledge, represented everything that Russ distrusted: the reliance on the warp's power, the pursuit of understanding that transcended the physical, the intellectual arrogance that Magnus displayed when he dismissed the concerns of those who warned him about the dangers of his studies. The Space Wolves campaigns during the Great Crusade were characterized by the same combination of aggression and effectiveness that would define the chapter for the next 10 millennia. The Wolves fought across hundreds of worlds, bringing compliance to populations that had resisted the Imperium's other overtures, crushing rebellions that had overwhelmed the forces that the Administratum had deployed to address them, and doing so with a speed and a brutality that earned them both the gratitude of the worlds they liberated and the wariness of the allies they fought alongside. The Space Wolves' approach to compliance was not subtle. Where the Ultramarines built, where the Wordbearers proselytized, where the Alpha Legion infiltrated, the Space Wolves arrived, assessed the situation, identified the enemy, and destroyed the enemy with a directness that left no room for ambiguity. The Wolves did not negotiate with targets that had been designated for compliance. They did not offer terms that allowed the enemy to save face. They provided a single choice: submit or be destroyed. The choice was genuine. The consequences of choosing destruction were exactly what the Space Wolves promised. The directness was effective. The directness was also isolating, because the Space Wolves' methods, however efficient, produced a reputation that made other Imperial forces uncomfortable. The Space Wolves' allies never questioned whether the Wolves would win. They questioned what the winning would look like, and the answer, more often than not, was a landscape that bore the marks of the Wolves' passage. Conquered, pacified, and deeply traumatized. The relationship between the Space Wolves and the other legions was complicated by the Executioner's role. The Space Wolves were not merely brother warriors. They were the Emperor's enforcement mechanism, the legion that might be deployed against any other legion that defied the Emperor's authority. The knowledge created a dynamic that prevented the Space Wolves from forming the close alliances that other legions maintained with each other. Russ had friends among his brothers. The Wolf King's personality, the boisterous, ale-drinking, saga-telling persona that Russ projected, made him likeable in a way that his role as executioner might otherwise have prevented. Russ got along with Jagatai Khan of the White Scars, whose warrior culture and whose appreciation for the hunt resonated with Russ's own values. Russ respected the Lion, L. Johnson of the Dark Angels, though the respect was complicated by a rivalry that produced as many conflicts as it did collaborations. But the friendships were shadowed by the role. Every Primarch who shared a drink with Russ, who traded stories and boasts and the kind of fraternal mockery that siblings engage in, understood that the brother sitting across the table was also the brother who might one day be sent to destroy them. Russ and Magnus clashed. Not physically, not at first, but philosophically, their opposing worldviews producing a tension that permeated their interactions and that would eventually erupt into the most devastating interlegion conflict of the Great Crusade. Russ distrusted the warp. He distrusted psykers. He distrusted the power that Magnus wielded with such casual confidence. Because Russ understood, with the instinctive clarity of a predator who recognizes danger before the danger has revealed itself, that the warp was not a tool to be used but a predator to be avoided, a force that consumed everyone who tried to master it. The irony of this position, given the Space Wolves' own rune priests, is not lost on the lore's readers. The Space Wolves employ psykers. The rune priests channel the warp's power through Fenrisian traditions, calling on the spirits of Fenris and the power of the world spirit to produce psychic effects that are functionally indistinguishable from the sorcery that Russ condemned Magnus for practicing. The wolves insist that their power is different, but the rune priests draw their power from Fenris itself, from the world spirit, from a source that is natural rather than warp-derived, and that the distinction between their power and Magnus's sorcery is the distinction between a healer's art and a poison's effect. The distinction is questionable. The lore does not settle the debate, because the debate is the point. The Space Wolves' hypocrisy, their willingness to condemn in others the same practices they employ themselves, is a feature of the chapter's character, a reflection of the broader hypocrisy that pervades the Imperium's institutions, and that the Space Wolves, for all their pretensions to straightforward honesty, are not immune to. The rune priests themselves are fascinating figures within the Space Wolves' hierarchy. They are psykers, warriors whose connection to the warp allows them to channel destructive energies into battlefield effects that range from the meteorological to the catastrophic. A rune priest can summon storms, can call lightning from clear skies, can freeze the enemy in their tracks with blasts of psychic cold that mirror the killing temperatures of a Fenrisian winter. The rune priests do not call themselves psykers. They do not use the vocabulary that the Imperium employs to describe psychic phenomena. They speak of the world spirit, of the power of Fenris, of the elemental forces that the Death World generates, and that the rune priests channel through rituals that are as much Fenrisian tradition as they are psychic discipline. The distinction is not merely semantic. The rune priests believe, with genuine conviction, that their power is fundamentally different from sorcery. They believe that the world spirit is a natural force, a power that exists independently of the warp, a manifestation of Fenris's own elemental nature rather than a product of the Immaterium's corrosive influence. Whether this belief is correct is one of the lore's most delicious ambiguities. The evidence suggests that the rune priest's power operates through the same mechanisms that all psychic powers operate through. The channeling of warp energy through the psyker's mind into effects that manifest in the material universe. The Fenrisian mythology that the rune priests use to frame their power may be a cultural overlay rather than a functional distinction, a set of rituals and traditions that provide psychological protection against the warp's corrupting influence without actually changing the nature of the power being channeled. But the psychological protection may be real. The Space Wolves have produced fewer psykers who have fallen to the warp's corruption than the statistical models would predict, and the rune priest's tradition of framing their power through Fenrisian mythology rather than through direct engagement with the warp's nature may provide a genuine buffer against the corruption that consumes psykers who approach the warp without such cultural mediation. The irony remains. The Space Wolves condemn sorcery while practicing it. The chapter that destroyed Prospero for its reliance on psychic power employs psychic power in every campaign, and the distinction between the Space Wolves' power and the Thousand Suns' sorcery is a distinction that the Space Wolves insist is fundamental, and that their critics insist is cosmetic. Russ may have known. The Primarch may have understood that the rune priest's power was, at its foundation, the same power that Magnus wielded, dressed in different clothing and justified through different mythology. If Russ knew, he did not care. The distinction, however artificial, served a purpose. It allowed the Space Wolves to use psychic power while condemning its use in others. And the condemnation, however hypocritical, gave Russ the moral authority to carry out the Emperor's orders when those orders targeted a legion whose reliance on psychic power had exceeded the Emperor's tolerance. The burning of Prospero is the moment that defined the Space Wolves' history, and it is the moment that the Space Wolves can never escape. The Emperor ordered Russ to bring Magnus to Terra. The order was a response to Magnus's catastrophic psychic message, the warning about Horus's betrayal that had shattered the wards protecting the Emperor's Webway project, and that had forced the Emperor onto the Golden Throne. Magnus had intended to save the Imperium. Magnus had destroyed the Emperor's greatest work. The original order was to bring Magnus back alive, to escort the Primarch of the Thousand Suns to Terra, where Magnus would answer for his actions, and where the Emperor would decide what consequences the transgression warranted. The order was clear. The order was measured. The order reflected the Emperor's understanding that Magnus's intentions, however disastrous their consequences, had not been malicious. The order was changed. Whether Horus altered it, using his authority as War Master to modify the Emperor's instructions before they reached Russ, or whether Russ interpreted the order in the harshest possible terms, choosing to read the Emperor's words as authorization for destruction rather than retrieval, is a question that the law does not definitively resolve. What is clear is that Russ arrived at Prospero with the intention not of escorting Magnus to Terra, but of punishing him, and the punishment that Russ had in mind was the punishment that the Emperor's executioner always delivered: total. The Space Wolves descended on Prospero with the full force of a legion assault. They were accompanied by the Sisters of Silence, the anti-Psyker warriors whose presence nullified the psychic abilities that the Thousand Suns relied on, and by elements of the Custodian Guard, the Emperor's own bodyguard, whose participation lent the assault the weight of imperial authority. The orbital bombardment came first. The Space Wolves' fleet, supported by the ships of the Sisters of Silence, unleashed a devastating barrage against Prospero's surface, the weapons targeting the planet's cities, its libraries, its centers of learning, with a precision that suggested the attack had been planned in detail. The bombardment destroyed Prospero's orbital defenses. The bombardment destroyed the planet's communication networks. The bombardment destroyed the warning systems that would have given the Thousand Suns time to prepare for the ground assault. The bombardment was not merely softening, it was erasure. The systematic destruction of a civilization's infrastructure before the ground forces arrived to complete the work. The ground assault followed. The Space Wolves deployed in force, their great companies dropping through Prospero's atmosphere in assault craft that delivered the Legion's warriors directly into the Thousand Suns' defensive positions. The fighting was immediate, intense, and savage, the Space Wolves engaging the Thousand Suns with the close-quarters ferocity that characterized every engagement the 6th Legion fought. The Custodian Guard fought alongside the Space Wolves, the Emperor's own bodyguard lending their golden armoured presence to an assault that carried the Emperor's authority. The Sisters of Silence moved through the battlefield like ghosts, their pariah gene nullifying the psychic abilities that the Thousand Suns relied on, stripping the Sorcerer Marines of their most powerful weapons and leaving them vulnerable to the conventional warfare that the Space Wolves excelled at. The Thousand Suns fought back. The Legion of Scholars fought with a desperation that reflected the understanding that this was not merely a battle but an extinction event, that the Space Wolves had come not to defeat them but to destroy them. The Thousand Suns used every psychic weapon in their arsenal, every sorcerous technique that their libraries contain, every desperate measure that a legion fighting for its survival could produce. Prospero burned. The world that Magnus had built, the civilization of scholars and libraries and repositories of accumulated knowledge that the Crimson King had spent centuries cultivating, was destroyed. The Space Wolves attacked without warning. without negotiation, without the opportunity for surrender that even the most aggressive of Imperial forces typically provided. Magnus could have fought. The Primarch's psychic power was sufficient to challenge even the Space Wolves' assault, to turn the battle, to exact a cost that might have forced Russ to reconsider his approach. Magnus chose not to. The Crimson King accepted the punishment as the consequence of his hubris, as the price that the Emperor demanded for the destruction of the Webway, as the penance that his mistake had earned. The acceptance broke the Thousand Sons more thoroughly than the fighting did. The sons of Magnus watched their father refuse to defend them, watched their world burn, while their Primarch stood still, and the despair that the refusal produced was the crack through which Tzeentch's corruption finally poured. Russ fought through Prospero. The Space Wolves destroyed the cities, the libraries, the centres of learning that the Thousand Sons had built over centuries. The destruction was methodical, thorough, and conducted with the clinical efficiency of the executioner carrying out a sentence. The Space Wolves did not enjoy the burning of Prospero. This is a detail that the lore emphasizes and that the Space Wolves' critics tend to overlook. The Wolves did not descend on Prospero with the gleeful savagery that a chapter that revelled in destruction would have displayed. They carried out their orders with the grim, joyless determination of warriors who understood the gravity of what they were doing and who did it anyway, because the Emperor's executioner does not question the Emperor's sentences. The aftermath of Prospero produced consequences that extended far beyond the destruction of a single world. The Thousand Sons, broken and betrayed, fled into the warp, where Tzeentch's influence completed the corruption that Prospero's destruction had begun. The legion that had been loyal, that had tried to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal, that had accepted punishment that it believed was justified, became one of the Imperium's most dangerous enemies, and the transformation was a direct consequence of the Space Wolves' assault. The irony is savage. The Space Wolves, sent to punish a legion that had broken the Emperor's rules about psychic power, created an enemy whose psychic power now exceeds anything the Thousand Sons possessed before the punishment. The burning of Prospero did not eliminate the threat that Magnus's sorcery represented. It amplified it, transforming a legion of disciplined scholars into a legion of chaos sorcerers whose knowledge of the warp is unmatched, and whose hatred of the Space Wolves is a motivating force that has endured for 10,000 years. The enmity between the Space Wolves and the Thousand Sons is the longest-running vendetta in the Imperium's history. The Thousand Sons have attacked Fenris multiple times. The Space Wolves have hunted the Thousand Sons warbands across the galaxy. The hatred is personal, institutional, and genetic, woven into both chapters' identities at a level that no diplomatic intervention can address. Magnus blames Russ for the destruction of his sons. Russ blamed himself, which is worse, because the guilt of a warrior who knows he was wrong is heavier than the rage of a warrior who believes he was wronged. The guilt came later. The guilt has never left. Russ carried the weight of Prospero for the rest of his mortal life. The Primarch who had destroyed a brother's world, who had burned the libraries that contained humanity's accumulated knowledge, who had broken a legion that had been loyal until the breaking made them otherwise, understood, in the years that followed Prospero, that the burning had been wrong. Not because the Emperor's order had been unjust, but because Russ's interpretation of the order had been excessive, that the destruction could have been avoided, that a different approach might have produced a different outcome. The understanding changed Russ. The Wolf King who returned from Prospero was not the same Primarch who had departed for it. The certainty that had characterized Russ's pre-Prospero personality, the absolute confidence in the rightness of the Emperor's cause and in his own role as the Emperor's instrument, was replaced by a doubt that the Wolf King had never previously experienced. The doubt did not weaken Russ. The doubt made Russ dangerous in a different way, because a weapon that questions its purpose is a weapon that might refuse to fire, and the Space Wolves' willingness to question the orders they received, to evaluate the justice of the missions they were given, to refuse commands that they considered unjust, is a quality that emerged from Prospero's ashes, and that has characterized the chapter ever since. The Horus Heresy found the Space Wolves fighting on the side of the Emperor, as everyone who understood Russ's character would have predicted. The Wolf King's loyalty to the Emperor was not contingent on approval or agreement. It was personal, rooted in the bond between the Primarch and the Father who had earned his respect through combat, and the bond was unbreakable, immune to the arguments and the temptations that had turned other Primarchs against the Emperor's cause. The Space Wolves fought through the heresy with the savagery that their reputation promised. They engaged the traitor legions on multiple fronts, their campaigns characterized by the aggressive, close-quarters fighting that the Space Wolves preferred, and that their Fenrisian gene seed enhanced. The Canis Helix, the genetic modification that distinguished the Space Wolves' gene seed from that of every other legion, produced warriors whose senses were sharper, whose reflexes were faster, whose aggression was more intense than those of other Space Marines, and the enhancement gave the Space Wolves an edge in the brutal, face-to-face combat that the heresy demanded. Russ fought Horus. The confrontation between the Wolf King and the Warmaster occurred during the Battle of Trizolian, and the battle was the most significant single combat of the heresy outside of the Emperor's final confrontation with Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Russ wounded Horus. The Wolf King drove his spear, the spear of Russ, into the Warmaster's body, inflicting a wound that pierced the corrupted flesh and that carried the essence of the weapon's power into Horus's being. The wound was significant, not because of the physical damage which Horus's enhanced and chaos-blessed physiology could absorb, but because of the spiritual impact. The spear of Russ carried a power that bypassed the physical and struck at the essence of the target, and the strike reached something inside Horus that the Chaos God's corruption had not entirely consumed. A fragment of the loyal son, a remnant of the Primarch who had loved the Emperor and who had been the greatest of his brothers before the fall. Russ tried to reach that fragment. The Wolf King, who had been the Emperor's executioner, who had destroyed Prospero without hesitation, hesitated. Instead of pressing the killing blow, Russ paused. He tried to bring Horus back. He tried to reach the brother beneath the corruption, to appeal to the loyalty that had once defined the Warmaster, to give Horus the chance to turn away from the path that was leading the galaxy to destruction. Horus did not turn. The Warmaster, consumed by chaos, strengthened by the Dark God's blessings, felt the reaching, felt the appeal, and crushed it. The fragment of the loyal Horus that Russ had tried to save was still there, buried beneath the corruption, but the fragment was not strong enough to overcome the darkness that surrounded it, and the fragment's presence made Horus's counterattack more savage, not less, because the Warmaster resented the reminder of what he had been. Horus struck Russ. The blow was devastating, the Warmaster's chaos enhanced strength driving the Wolf King to the ground, shattering armor, cracking bone, inflicting wounds that would have killed any mortal and that left even a Primarch broken. Russ's spine was damaged, his body was ruined. The Wolf King, who had been the Emperor's most fearsome warrior, was reduced to a bleeding, broken figure on the deck of a warship that reeked of chaos. The wolves saved him. Russ's warriors, the Space Wolves who had fought alongside their Primarch, dragged the broken Wolf King from the battlefield and carried him to safety, their devotion to their father overriding the tactical assessment that might have told them the battle was lost. The hesitation taught Russ a lesson that the Wolf King carried for the rest of his life, that mercy, extended to the wrong person at the wrong moment, is not virtue but weakness, and that the executioner's duty, however painful, exists for a reason. The lesson did not make Russ cruel. The lesson made Russ careful, and the caution, combined with the guilt that the hesitation produced, reshaped the Wolf King's personality in ways that his brothers noticed but could not articulate. Horus, did not turn. The Warmaster struck Russ down, nearly killing the Wolf King, inflicting wounds that would trouble the Primarch for the rest of his life. The hesitation had cost Russ the fight, and had nearly cost him his life. And the lesson of the hesitation, that mercy offered to the enemy of the Emperor was weakness rather than virtue, was a lesson that Russ absorbed with the pain of his wounds. The Alpha Legion ambush at Yarant is one of the Heresy's most significant engagements involving the Space Wolves, a battle that nearly destroyed the 6th Legion and that prevented Russ from reaching Terra for the siege. The Alpha Legion, the 20th Legion, led by the enigmatic twin Primarchs Alfarius and Omegon, intercepted the Space Wolves as they moved toward Terra. The ambush was meticulously planned. The Alpha Legion's trademark combination of intelligence, infiltration, and misdirection, producing a trap that caught the Space Wolves in a disadvantageous position, and that forced Russ to fight through the Alpha Legion's forces rather than bypassing them. The fighting was brutal. The Space Wolves, whose combat doctrine favoured the direct assault, found themselves engaged in the kind of guerrilla warfare that the Alpha Legion excelled at, and that the Wolves were temperamentally unsuited to counter. The Alpha Legion struck and withdrew, bleeding the Space Wolves through 1,000 small engagements that individually were insignificant, but that cumulatively wore down the Legion's strength and delayed its advance toward Terra. Russ was wounded. The Primarch fought through the Alpha Legion's forces with the ferocity that his reputation demanded, but the cumulative effect of the fighting, combined with the wounds he had sustained in his earlier confrontation with Horus, left the Wolf King diminished, physically weakened in a way that Russ had never experienced before. The Space Wolves broke through, eventually, but the delay was fatal to the 6th Legion's ability to reach Terra in time for the siege, and the absence of the Space Wolves from the defence of the Imperial Palace is a wound that the chapter carries to this day. The Space Wolves did not reach Terra for the siege. The Legion was engaged elsewhere, fighting the traitor forces that Horus had deployed to prevent the Loyalist legions from reinforcing the Emperor's defence of the Imperial Palace. The absence from the siege is a source of profound regret within the chapter, a failure that the Space Wolves have carried for 10,000 years. The knowledge that they were not there when the Emperor needed them most, that their Primarch was recovering from wounds while the Emperor was dying on the Golden Throne. After the Heresy, Russ changed. The Primarch, who had once been the Emperor's most enthusiastic instrument, became contemplative, questioning, haunted by the decisions that had defined his role in the Heresy and by the outcomes that those decisions had produced. The burning of Prospero weighed on him. The failure to kill Horus weighed on him. The absence from the siege weighed on him. The accumulated weight of guilt and regret produced a Primarch who was no longer the boisterous, ale-drinking, saga-telling Wolf King of the pre-Heresy era, but a more sombre, more reflective figure who understood that the galaxy's salvation had come at a cost that could never be repaid. Russ disappeared. During the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, the annual celebration that the Space Wolves held in honour of the Emperor, Russ stood before his assembled chapter and told them that he was leaving. He told them that he had seen something, a vision, a revelation, a glimpse of a future that required him to go. He told them he would return, at the time of the Imperium's greatest need, at the prophesied hour of the Wolf Time, when the galaxy would face its final battle and the Wolf King would be needed once more. He left with his personal retinue, the Varagaya, his closest companions. He left behind Bjorn, his most trusted warrior, to serve as the first great wolf of the chapter in the Primarch's absence. He entered the Eye of Terror, and the Eye swallowed him, and the Space Wolves have been waiting for his return ever since. Bjorn, the Fell-Handed, the oldest living loyalist Space Marine, the warrior who fought beside Daemon Russ during the Great Crusade and the Heresy, who was entrusted with the leadership of the chapter when Russ departed, and who has endured, encased in the sarcophagus of a venerable dreadnought for 10,000 years. Bjorn was Russ's last companion on Fenris. When the Wolf King departed into the Eye of Terror, he left Bjorn behind, not because Bjorn was less trusted than the Varriger who accompanied the Primarch, but because Bjorn was needed. Someone had to lead the chapter in the Primarch's absence. Someone had to maintain the continuity between the Space Wolves that Russ had built and the Space Wolves that the chapter would become. Someone had to remember. Bjorn remembers everything. The Dreadnought's consciousness, sustained across 10 millennia by the life support systems of his sarcophagus, preserves the memories of a warrior who fought beside the Primarch during the Great Crusade, who witnessed the burning of Prospero, who served through the Heresy, and who was present at the moment when Russ walked away. Bjorn's memories are the chapter's most precious archive, a living record of events that no other source can verify, and that no written record can match for authenticity. The chapter treats Bjorn with a reverence that borders on worship, a reverence that the ancient warrior himself finds uncomfortable. Bjorn does not want to be worshipped. Bjorn wants to fight. The warrior inside the dreadnought retains the Fenrisian temperament that defined his mortal life, and the enforced inactivity of the millennia-long stasis periods that the chapter imposes between Bjorn's awakenings is a source of frustration that the ancient warrior expresses with characteristic Space Wolf directness. Bjorn is not merely old. Bjorn is ancient in a way that no other loyalist warrior can claim. The Dreadnought's body has been rebuilt, repaired, and maintained across 10 millennia, the biological remnant of the warrior inside sustained by the life support systems that keep the mortally wounded alive within their armoured tomb. Bjorn sleeps. For centuries at a time, the ancient warrior is placed in stasis. His consciousness suspended, his systems powered down to the minimum necessary to maintain the biological core that houses his identity. Bjorn is awakened for crises. When the chapter faces a threat that requires the ancient warrior's counsel, when the sagas need to be told by the one who lived them, when the chapter's very identity is at stake, and the only authority that can resolve the dispute is the authority of the warrior who served beside the Primarch himself, Bjorn is roused from his millennia-long slumber and brought to the Great Hall to speak. Every 1,000 years, Bjorn tells the tale of Russ's disappearance. The chapter gathers, the warriors of every great company assembling in the Fang's Great Hall, and Bjorn recounts the story that only he can tell, the last words of the Primarch, the circumstances of his departure, the promise of his return. The telling is sacred. The telling is the chapter's most important ritual, the ceremony that connects the modern Space Wolves to their origins and that sustains the belief, the absolute unshakable belief that Russ will return. Bjorn is also the chapter's most effective diplomat, a role that the ancient warrior occupies with a reluctance that borders on hostility. When the Inquisition came to Fenris, when the institutional conflict between the Space Wolves and the Imperium's overseers reached a crisis point that threatened to erupt into open warfare, it was Bjorn who was awakened to deal with the situation. And it was Bjorn's presence, the sheer, overwhelming weight of 10,000 years of authority, that prevented the crisis from escalating into catastrophe. The Fang is the Space Wolves' fortress monastery, and it is by any measure one of the most formidable defensive positions in the galaxy. Built into the largest mountain on Asaheim, the only stable continent on Fenris, the Fang rises above the clouds, its peak extending beyond the atmosphere into the void itself, where the chapter's warships dock at orbital facilities that are integrated into the mountain's summit. The Fang is enormous. The fortress extends deep into the mountain's interior, its tunnels and halls and chambers carved from the living rock over 10,000 years of continuous construction. The Great Hall, where the chapter gathers for feasts and councils and the telling of sagas, is large enough to accommodate the entire chapter, a vast, torch-lit cavern whose walls are carved with the deeds of 10,000 years of warriors and whose ceiling is lost in the darkness above. The Great Hall is the chapter's heart, the place where the pack gathers, where the bonds between warriors are renewed, where the living and the dead are connected through the sagas that bridge the gap between mortal memory and eternal legacy. The Space Wolves fleet reflects the chapter's character, aggressive, well-maintained, and decorated with the same Fenrisian iconography that adorns the chapter's armour and weapons. The chapter's warships bear names drawn from Fenrisian mythology, each vessel's history recorded in the sagas alongside the deeds of the warriors who have served aboard it. The fleet operates from the Fang's orbital docking facilities, the warships ascending from the mountain's summit into the void, their departure a spectacle that the chapter's serfs observe with the reverence that the Fenrisian culture grants to the warriors who carry the fight beyond the world's boundaries. The Space Wolves' preferred naval tactic is the boarding action, the ship-to-ship combat that translates the chapter's melee superiority from the ground to the void. A Space Wolves boarding action is a characteristically savage affair, the warriors cutting through the enemy vessel's hull and fighting through the ship's corridors with the same ferocity that they display on planetary battlefields. The fleet has fought in engagements that span the galaxy, from the naval battles of the Heresy to the void wars of the modern era. The chapter's ships have engaged Chaos fleets, Xenos armadas, and, during the months of shame, the Inquisition's own warships, the last engagement a demonstration of the Space Wolves' willingness to fight any enemy, even one that bears the Imperium's own authority. When the chapter's principles are at stake, the fortress is defended by systems that combine Imperial technology with Fenrisian ingenuity. The weapons and the shields and the defensive batteries supplemented by the natural defences that Fenris provides, the extreme cold, the hostile wildlife, the volcanic activity that makes any approach to the Fang through the planet's surface a journey through an environment that kills the unprepared. The Fang has been attacked, it has been besieged, it has never fallen. The fortress has endured assaults by Chaos warbands, by the Thousand Suns, by the forces of the apostate Bukharis during the Age of Apostasy, and by the combined might of the Inquisition and the Grey Knights during the months of shame. Every assault has been repelled, the Fang's defences proving sufficient to withstand forces that would have overwhelmed lesser fortifications. The Great Hall is where the Space Wolves are most themselves. The hall is a mead hall, a feast hall, a place of celebration and storytelling that reflects the Fenrisian culture that the chapter has maintained for 10,000 years. The Space Wolves feast. They drink. They tell sagas, the epic poems that record the chapter's history, in a form that is as much performance as narrative. The Skalds reciting the deeds of heroes in verses that are meant to be heard rather than read, experienced rather than studied. The sagas are the Space Wolves' history, their literature, and their moral instruction, combined into a single art form that serves all three purposes simultaneously. The Skalds, the warrior poets who compose and recite the sagas, hold a position within the chapter that has no equivalent in other chapters. They are the keepers of the pack's memory, the artists whose craft preserves the deeds of the dead and inspires the deeds of the living. The Fenrisian concept of honour is different from the formalised honour codes that other chapters maintain. Fenrisian honour is personal rather than institutional, earned through deeds rather than granted through rank, and measured by the opinions of the warriors' packmates rather than by the evaluations of distant authorities. A Space Wolf's honour is their saga. The honour is not an abstract quality that exists independently of the warrior's actions. The honour is the cumulative record of the warrior's deeds, the saga that the Skalds compose and that the pack remembers, and the warrior's behaviour is shaped by the constant awareness that every action, every decision, every moment of courage or cowardice is being observed, recorded, and woven into the narrative that will define the warrior's legacy. This produces warriors who are intensely aware of their audience. A Space Wolf does not fight alone, even when the warrior is physically isolated. The Space Wolf fights in the presence of the Skalds, in the presence of the pack, in the presence of the ancestors whose sagas are told in the Great Hall. The warrior fights knowing that the deeds performed today will be recited tomorrow, and the knowledge shapes the warrior's choices in ways that formal military discipline cannot replicate. The saga demands courage. The saga demands ferocity. The saga demands the willingness to face impossible odds and to fight regardless of the outcome, because the saga honours the warrior who dies fighting more than the warrior who survives by retreating. The saga does not honour stupidity. The Fenrisian warriors are too pragmatic for that, but the saga demands that the warrior's death, when it comes, be worth the telling. A space wolf fights for many reasons: duty, loyalty, the joy of combat that the Canis Helix encourages, but above all, a space wolf fights for the saga. The warrior's greatest ambition is not promotion or political power or the accumulation of honours. The warrior's greatest ambition is to perform deeds worthy of the saga, to fight with such courage and ferocity that the skalds will remember the warrior's name and will recite the warrior's deeds in the Great Hall for centuries after the warrior has fallen. The saga is immortality. Not the daemonic immortality of the Chaos God's champions, which preserves the body at the cost of the soul. True immortality. The immortality of memory. The persistence of the warrior's name and deeds in the minds and voices of those who come after. A space wolf whose saga is told in the Great Hall of the Fang lives on in a way that matters more than physical survival, because the saga endures beyond the individual, carrying the warrior's courage into the future where it inspires new warriors to perform new deeds worthy of new sagas. The Space Wolves are not merely the chapter that recruits from Fenris, they are part of Fenris. The chapter is woven into the planet's cultural fabric as thoroughly as the wolves and the ice and the volcanic fire that define the world's character. The Fenrisian tribes view the Space Wolves as the gods' chosen warriors, the heroes of legend who have been elevated beyond mortal capability and who fight the wars that the sagas describe. A young Fenrisian warrior does not merely aspire to join the Space Wolves. A young Fenrisian warrior aspires to be taken, to be selected, to be deemed worthy of transformation into one of the Sky Warriors whose deeds fill the sagas that the tribes tell around their fires during the long Fenrisian winters. The selection is a death. The young warrior who is taken by the wolf priests does not return to their tribe. The transformation from mortal to space marine is absolute. The warrior's previous identity consumed by the process and replaced by the identity of a son of Rus. The tribe mourns the warrior as dead, and the mourning is appropriate, because the person who was the Fenrisian tribesman is gone, replaced by a being whose capabilities, whose lifespan, and whose purpose transcend anything that mortal life can provide. The warriors who are selected and who survive the transformation occasionally return to observe the tribes from a distance, watching the people they once belonged to with the detached affection of predators observing prey that they have chosen not to hunt. The observation is not cruel, it is wistful. A reminder of the mortal life that the warrior surrendered in exchange for the immortal purpose that the chapter provides. The culture of the saga shapes every aspect of the Space Wolves' behaviour. The chapter's warriors seek not merely victory but memorable victory, not merely survival but glorious survival. And the distinction between effective warfare and saga-worthy warfare is the distinction that separates the Space Wolves from every other chapter in the Imperium. The mead halls of the Fang are where the culture finds its fullest expression. The warriors gather, the mead flows, the skalds stand, and the sagas are told. The telling is not a passive event. The warriors participate, adding their own embellishments, challenging the skalds' accounts, debating the details with a passion that reflects the importance that the chapter places on getting the story right. The Fenrisian concept of the afterlife shapes the Space Wolves' relationship with death in ways that distinguish the chapter from every other Space Marine force. The Fenrisians believe in a warrior's paradise, an afterlife where the fallen join the great hall of the gods and feast and fight for eternity. The Space Wolves have adapted this belief to their own mythology, the chapter's fallen warriors joining the ranks of the dead heroes who feast alongside Russ in the mythic hall that awaits them beyond death. The belief produces warriors who do not fear death. Other Space Marines do not fear death either, their conditioning and their genetic modification producing soldiers who are psychologically incapable of the paralytic terror that death inspires in normal humans. But the Space Wolves' lack of fear is qualitatively different. It is not merely the absence of fear, it is the presence of anticipation, the warrior's belief that death in battle is not merely acceptable but desirable, a transition from the mortal saga to the eternal saga, from the feast in the Fang to the feast in the halls of the gods. The anticipation produces a fighting style that is more reckless, more aggressive, more willing to accept wounds that other Space Marines would avoid. A Space Wolf who charges into the teeth of the enemy's fire is not committing suicide. The warrior is rushing toward the saga's climax, the moment when the warrior's deeds will be remembered and when the warrior's place in the eternal feast will be secured. The Wolf Priests maintain the traditions that govern the fallen. The bodies of Space Wolves who die in battle are recovered when possible, their gene seed harvested for the creation of new warriors, their weapons and armor distributed among their surviving packmates. The Fallen Warriors saga is completed by the Scolds. The final verse is added to record the manner of the warrior's death and the deeds that preceded it. A Space Wolf who dies well, whose final battle produces a saga worthy of the eternal feast, is honoured with a celebration that combines mourning and triumph in equal measure. The pack mourns the loss of a brother. The pack celebrates the brother's entry into the afterlife. The mead flows. The sagas are told, and the fallen warrior's name is added to the rolls of the dead heroes whose deeds inspire the living warriors who will one day join them. Getting the story right matters, because the story is the legacy. The story is what remains when the warrior is gone, and the warrior's reputation within the chapter and within the broader Imperium is determined not by official records or administratum files, but by the saga that the Skalds compose and that the warriors preserve. The feasting is not trivial. The feasting is central to the Space Wolves' identity, a ritual of communal celebration that binds the warriors together in a way that the sterile monastic cultures of other chapters do not replicate. A Space Marine chapter that does not eat, drink and celebrate together is a chapter whose warriors are individuals. A chapter that feasts together is a pack, and the pack is everything. The Space Wolves chapter organisation reflects their origins on Fenris rather than the prescriptions of the Codex Astartes, where other chapters are organised into companies. The Space Wolves are organised into great companies, each one led by a Wolf Lord who commands with an authority that combines the military command of a conventional company captain with the tribal leadership of a Fenrisian Jarl. Each great company is a distinct entity, with its own traditions, its own character, its own approach to warfare that reflects the personality of the Wolf Lord who leads it. The great companies are not interchangeable. They are individual, each one shaped by the leader whose name it bears, and the differences between the great companies produce a chapter that is more diverse in its tactical approaches than the standardized structures of other chapters allow. The Great Wolf is the chapter master, the supreme commander of the Space Wolves, and the title carries a weight that exceeds the authority of most chapter masters. The Great Wolf leads by example and by charisma, the authority of the position reinforced by the respect that the Wolf Lords and their warriors grant to the leader who has proven himself the most capable among them. The great companies of the Space Wolves are as distinct as the Wolf Lords who lead them. Each company develops its own tactical preferences, its own traditions, its own identity within the broader structure of the chapter's culture. Harald Deathwolf leads the company that is most closely associated with the Thunderwolf cavalry, his warriors riding the great beasts into battle with a ferocity that combines the Space Wolves' aggression with the Thunderwolves' predatory instincts. Deathwolf's campaigns are characterized by fast, mobile warfare, the Thunderwolf cavalry sweeping across the battlefield in charges that shatter enemy formations and that produce a visual spectacle that inspires saga-worthy descriptions. From Dragongaze leads the Drake Slayers, a great company whose reputation for stubbornness exceeds even the Space Wolves' already considerable standard. Dragongaze does not retreat. His warriors hold their ground with a tenacity that makes the Fang's own fortifications look permissive, and the casualties that the Drake Slayers absorb in the process of holding positions that other formations would have abandoned are a testament to the great company's refusal to yield. Bran Redmaw is perhaps the most controversial Wolf Lord, a warrior who bears the curse of the Wolfen more visibly than any other Space Wolf in a position of command. Redmaw's condition, his proximity to the transformation that the chapter treats as its greatest shame, makes him an uncomfortable figure for the Wolf Priests and for the chapter's more traditional members. His effectiveness in battle, however, is undeniable, and his great company fights with a ferocity that reflects their lord's proximity to the beast within. Grimnar's own great company, the Champions of Fenris, serves as the chapter's primary strike force, the formation that the Great Wolf leads personally and that represents the Space Wolves' capabilities at their peak. The Champions are veterans, warriors who have been selected for the Great Wolf's company through demonstrated excellence, and their presence on a battlefield signals that the Space Wolves have committed their finest warriors to the engagement. Logan Grimnar is the current Great Wolf, and Grimnar is, by any measure, one of the most formidable chapter masters in the Imperium. The Old Wolf, as he is known, has led the Space Wolves for over 800 years, a tenure that exceeds the service of most chapter masters and that has produced a leader whose tactical acumen, political savvy, and personal combat prowess have been tested in campaigns that span the galaxy. Grimnar's rise to Great Wolf is a saga in itself. The Old Wolf began as a bloodclaw, as all Space Wolves do, his early campaigns marked by the impetuous aggression that characterizes the chapter's youngest warriors. What distinguished the young Grimnar from his peers was not merely his combat prowess, which was considerable, but his ability to see beyond the immediate fight, to understand the broader context of the battles he fought, to recognize that the most important victories were not always the loudest. Grimnar rose through the ranks through a combination of martial excellence and the political intelligence that the Space Wolves' culture does not always value, but that the chapter's leadership requires. The Old Wolf learned to navigate the complex dynamics of the great companies, to manage the competing egos of the Wolf Lords, to maintain the chapter's cohesion in the face of external threats and internal rivalries. The Axe Morkai, Grimnar's weapon, is a relic whose history is as long as the Old Wolf's tenure. The double-headed frost axe, one blade forged from a daemon weapon that Grimnar took from a defeated Chaos champion, and the other blessed by the chapter's rune priests, represents the duality that defines the Space Wolves, the blade of destruction and the blade of protection, the capacity for savagery and the commitment to defense, combined in a single weapon wielded by a warrior who embodies both qualities. Grimnar's defining characteristic is his refusal to compromise on the principles that he believes the Space Wolves embody. The Old Wolf does not bend. He does not accommodate institutional pressure. He does not defer to authority that he considers illegitimate, and his definition of illegitimate authority encompasses a broad swathe of the Imperium's bureaucratic apparatus. Grimnar's conflict with the Inquisition defined the Space Wolves' post-heresy history and produced the event known as the Months of Shame, a conflict that brought the chapter to the brink of open war with the Imperium's own institutions. The First War for Armageddon was the catalyst. The war itself was a desperate defense against a chaos invasion led by the Daemon Primarch Angron, whose World Eaters and Daemonic legions had attacked the Hive World with a ferocity that nearly overwhelmed the planet's defenders. Grimnar led 300 Space Wolves alongside over 100 Grey Knights in the campaign and the combined force. Fighting alongside the Armageddon Steel Legion and the Planetary Defense Forces, eventually banished Angron and defeated the Chaos Invasion. The victory was Pyrrhic in a way that the Space Wolves had not anticipated. The Inquisition, the Ordo Malleus in particular, decided that the human survivors of the war could not be allowed to live. The soldiers and civilians who had witnessed the Chaos Invasion, who had seen daemons and Chaos Space Marines and the horrors that the warp could produce, were deemed a contamination risk. The Inquisition ordered them sterilized and relocated, their lives effectively ended through forced resettlement on penal worlds where their knowledge of the war would die with them. Grimnar was furious. The old wolf had fought beside the soldiers of Armageddon. He had watched them hold the line against chaos with a courage that matched anything the Space Wolves themselves had displayed. He had seen them bleed and die in defense of the Imperium, and the Inquisition's reward for their sacrifice was extermination. The Space Wolves refused. Grimnar declared that the Imperium's defenders deserved better than execution at the hands of the institutions they had served, and the Space Wolves began intercepting the Inquisition's transport ships, freeing the prisoners and obstructing the purge that the Ordo Malleus had ordered. Grimnar's defiance was not merely instinctive. The old wolf understood the Inquisition's reasoning, understood the theological arguments about the contaminating influence of chaos, understood the institutional logic that drove the Ordo Malleus to conclude that the Armageddon survivors represented a risk to the broader Imperium's security. He rejected the reasoning. Not because the reasoning was wrong, though Grimnar believed it was, because the reasoning, however logically sound, produced a conclusion that violated the principles that the Space Wolves existed to uphold. The Imperium was built to protect humanity. The Space Marines were created to defend the Emperor's people. An institution that destroys the people it is supposed to protect has failed, regardless of the justifications it offers, and Grimnar was not willing to participate in that failure. The old wolf began intercepting the Inquisition's black ships, the vessels that carried the Armageddon survivors to the penal worlds and the sterilization facilities that the Ordo Malleus had designated. The Space Wolves freed the prisoners, relocating them to worlds outside the Inquisition's immediate reach, defying the Ordo's authority with a directness that stunned the inquisitorial establishment. The Inquisition responded with escalation. Inquisitor Lord Kisnaros, the architect of the Armageddon Purge, mobilized the resources of the Ordo Malleus against the Space Wolves, deploying warships, Grey Knights kill teams, and the entire Red Hunters chapter to enforce the Purge and to bring the rebellious Space Wolves to heel. The escalation produced casualties on both sides. Space Wolves' ships were destroyed, inquisitorial vessels were destroyed. Warriors on both sides died in engagements that served no purpose except the escalation of a conflict that neither side had wanted, and that both sides found themselves unable to stop. The Grey Knights' role in the conflict was the source of the name that history has given the period. The Daemon Hunters of the Emperor's most secretive chapter found themselves deployed against brother Space Marines in a conflict that the Grey Knights' own warriors considered shameful. The Grey Knights were warriors of the Emperor, created to fight daemons, trained to combat the forces of chaos, and the deployment against fellow servants of the Emperor felt, to many Grey Knights, like a perversion of their purpose. The shame deepened when the Grey Knights began taking casualties. Brothers fell, killed not by daemons or heretics but by Space Marines who bore the Emperor's Aquila and who fought in the Emperor's name. The deaths were a stain on the Grey Knights' honour that no amount of institutional justification could remove. The conflict escalated. The Inquisition deployed the Grey Knights and the Red Hunters Space Marine chapter to enforce its authority. The Space Wolves fought back. Ships were destroyed. Warriors on both sides died. The Grey Knights, the Daemon hunting chapter whose warriors had fought alongside the Space Wolves on Armageddon, found themselves fighting against their former allies in a conflict that the Grey Knights themselves found deeply shameful. The Months of Shame earned their name from the Grey Knights who participated in the conflict. The Daemon Hunters, whose purpose was the defense of humanity against the forces of chaos, had been deployed against fellow Space Marines to enforce an inquisitorial order that the Grey Knights' own warriors considered unjust. The shame of fighting brothers, of killing Space Marines who had committed no crime except defying an order they considered immoral, was a burden that the Grey Knights carried long after the conflict's resolution. The conflict reached its climax when the Inquisitor Lord Kisnaros assembled a fleet and moved against Fenris itself, intending to hold the Space Wolves' homeworld hostage to force Grimnar's compliance. The fleet, which included inquisitorial warships, Grey Knights vessels, and the entire Red Hunters chapter, surrounded Fenris and targeted the Fang for bombardment. Grimnar responded with characteristic directness. The Old Wolf led a force of Terminators in a boarding action against the Inquisition's flagship, fighting his way to the bridge and personally killing Kisnaros in close combat. The fighting could have continued. The fighting could have escalated into a full-scale war between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition, a war that would have weakened both institutions and that would have served only the enemies of the Imperium. Bjorn prevented this. The ancient dreadnought, awakened for the crisis, intervened, his 10,000-year authority carrying a weight that even Grimnar's rage could not override. Bjorn counselled peace. Not because the Space Wolves were wrong, but because the continuation of the war would produce consequences that exceeded the cost of the injustice that had started it. A truce was negotiated. The terms were unsatisfying to both sides. The Space Wolves did not receive justice for the Armageddon survivors. The Inquisition did not receive the submission of the chapter. The conflict produced no winners, only casualties. And the casualties included the trust between the Space Wolves and the Imperium's institutions, a trust that has never been restored. Grimnar has never forgiven the Inquisition. The Old Wolf's hostility toward the Ordo Melius and the broader inquisitorial apparatus is well documented and is a source of ongoing tension between the Space Wolves and the Imperium's governing structures. The Space Wolves obstruct inquisitorial operations whenever they encounter them. They protect populations that the Inquisition has targeted for purging. They refuse to cooperate with investigations that they consider unjust, and they do so with the absolute certainty that their actions are consistent with the Emperor's will, even when the Emperor's servants disagree. The Battle of the Fang is another defining moment, a conflict that demonstrated both the Space Wolves' resilience and the depth of the enmity between the Wolves and the Thousand Sons. In the 32nd millennium, the Thousand Sons, led by Magnus the Red himself, attacked Fenris. The assault was motivated by revenge, the Daemon Primarch returning to inflict upon the Space Wolves the same destruction that the Space Wolves had inflicted upon Prospero 10,000 years earlier. The attack was also motivated by strategic calculation. Magnus sought to destroy the Tempering, a secret project that the Space Wolves' Wolf High Priest, Thar Ariak Haralda, was conducting to stabilize the Canis Helix and to enable the creation of successor chapters from the Space Wolves' gene seed. The Battle of the Fang is one of the Law's great siege narratives, a story of defiance against overwhelming odds that encapsulates everything the Space Wolves represent. Magnus had planned the assault with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized the Daemon Primarch's approach to warfare. The Thousand Sons sorcerers had engineered the diversion that drew the bulk of the Space Wolves' forces away from Fenris, sending the great companies on a campaign that was designed to look legitimate, to present a threat convincing enough that the chapter could not ignore it, while leaving Fenris defended by a skeleton garrison that could not hope to withstand a full-scale Thousand Sons assault. The deception worked. The great companies deployed, the Fang's garrison was reduced to a fraction of the chapter's strength, and the Thousand Sons emerged from the warp in force, their fleet surrounding Fenris, their ground forces deploying against the Fang with the methodical precision of sorcerers who had spent millennia planning their revenge. The Fang was defended by a skeleton garrison, the bulk of the chapter's forces deployed on a campaign that had been engineered by the Thousand Sons to draw the Space Wolves away from their homeworld. The defenders held. For 3 years, the Space Wolves' reduced garrison held the Fang against the Thousand Sons' assault, using the fortress's defences, the planet's hostile environment, and their own stubborn, savage refusal to die to prevent Magnus from achieving his objective. The siege was 3 years of grinding, desperate, heroic warfare. The skeleton garrison fought with every weapon the Fang provided, the fortress's automated defences, the gun emplacements that lined the mountain's approaches, the ancient void shields that protected the Fang's interior from orbital bombardment, and the warriors themselves. Every space wolf in the garrison fighting with the knowledge that they were defending the heart of their chapter against the enemy who had sworn to destroy it. The Thousand Sons attacked with sorcery. The warp's energies, channeled through the Thousand Sons' rubric marines and their living sorcerer masters, battered the Fang's defences in ways that conventional weapons could not. The walls of reality thinned around the fortress, the warp bleeding through into the material world, producing localised demonic incursions that the garrison had to combat alongside the Thousand Sons' conventional assault. The defenders held. Floor by floor, corridor by corridor, the Space Wolves fought the Thousand Sons through the Fang's interior, giving ground where they had to and holding where they could, using the fortress's layout to channel the attackers into killing zones where the defenders' knowledge of the terrain gave them the advantage. Wolf Lord Ver Greylock led the defence with a tactical acumen that earned him a permanent place in the chapter's sagas. Greylock understood that the garrison could not defeat the Thousand Sons through force of arms, because the Thousand Sons' numbers and their sorcerous capabilities exceeded what the garrison could match. Greylock fought to delay, to endure, to hold the Fang until reinforcements arrived, and the endurance required the kind of stubbornness and creativity that the Fenrisian warrior culture produced in abundance. The reinforcements came. Wolf Lord Curl Grimblood, returning from a campaign, struck the Thousand Sons from behind, his fleet appearing in Fenris's orbit and deploying directly into the battle. The Thousand Sons, caught between the Fang's defences and Grimblood's attacking force, were driven from Fenris, their assault broken by the combination of the garrison's endurance and the relief force's aggression. Magnus destroyed the tempering. The Daemon Primarch reached Heraldir's laboratory and obliterated the research that had represented the Space Wolves' best hope of overcoming the Canis Helix's instability. The destruction ensured that the Space Wolves would remain a single chapter, unable to create successors, their gene seed's peculiarities forever, preventing the kind of expansion that other chapters achieved through the founding of successor chapters. The Wolf Brothers. The Space Wolves' one and only successor chapter, created during the second founding after the Heresy, and the proof that the Canis Helix's instability was not merely a theoretical concern. The Wolf Brothers received the Space Wolves' gene seed and established themselves as an independent chapter, as the Codex Astartes required. Within a few generations, the Wolf Brothers began to exhibit the symptoms of the Canis Helix's instability: mutations, behavioural changes, the progressive deterioration of their warriors into feral bestial creatures that bore more resemblance to wolves than to space marines. The chapter was disbanded. The failure was total. The genetic instability producing mutations that could not be controlled and that reduced the Wolf Brothers from a functioning space marine chapter to a scattered collection of feral monsters whose behaviour more closely resembled the Wolfen than the warriors they had been designed to be. The failure traumatized the Space Wolves. The chapter watched its only offspring degenerate, watched the warriors who carried their gene seed lose the battle against the beast within, and the watching produced a grief that the chapter has never fully processed. The grief is complicated by guilt. The Space Wolves provided the gene seed that produced the Wolf Brothers. The Canis Helix's instability, the genetic flaw that destroyed the successor chapter, was a flaw that the Space Wolves carried in their own gene seed and that they had failed to warn the Wolf Brothers about with sufficient emphasis. The Space Wolves knew the risk. They knew what the Canis Helix could produce. They allowed the Wolf Brothers to be created anyway, and the creation's failure is a weight that the chapter carries alongside the other weights that its 10,000-year history has accumulated. The failure also produced a strategic vulnerability. The Space Wolves cannot create successor chapters. The Canis Helix's instability prevents the gene seed from being replicated outside Fenris's cultural and environmental context, and the failure of the Wolf Brothers proved that the instability is not theoretical, but functional. The Space Wolves are alone. One chapter. 1,000 warriors. No successors to provide reinforcement. No daughter chapters to share the burden of the wars that the galaxy produces. The isolation makes the Space Wolves simultaneously more precious and more vulnerable than other chapters. A chapter that cannot be replaced is a chapter that the Imperium cannot afford to lose, and the knowledge that the Space Wolves are irreplaceable shapes the Imperium's relationship with the chapter in ways that both the Space Wolves and the Imperium's administrators find uncomfortable. The Wolf Brothers' fate confirmed what the Space Wolves had feared: that their gene seed could not be replicated outside the cultural and environmental context of Fenris, that the Canis Helix required the planet's unique conditions and the chapter's traditions to maintain the balance between the enhancement that the Helix provided and the curse that the Helix carried. The Canis Helix is the mutation that makes the Space Wolves what they are, and the curse of the Wolfen is the price that the mutation demands. The Canis Helix is implanted during the final stage of a Space Wolf aspirant's initiation, the gene seed modification that transforms a Fenrisian warrior into a Space Marine. The Helix enhances the warrior's senses beyond even the standard Space Marine baseline. Smell that can detect individual scents across kilometers, hearing that can distinguish whispered conversation through meters of stone, vision that adapts to darkness and distance with a precision that exceeds what the standard Astartes modifications provide. The Helix also enhances aggression. The warrior becomes more feral, more instinct-driven, more closely connected to the predatory nature that the wolves of Fenris embody. The enhancement is useful, producing warriors whose combat reflexes are sharper and whose willingness to close with the enemy exceeds the already formidable aggression of standard Space Marines. The enhancement is also dangerous. The Canis Helix carries the potential for a transformation that goes beyond enhancement, a mutation that pushes the warrior past the boundary between human and beast, and that produces a creature known as a Wolfen, a towering lupine monster that retains the warrior's strength and combat abilities, but that has lost the warrior's consciousness. The rational mind replaced by the instincts of a predator. The Wolfen transformation is the Space Wolves' greatest secret and their greatest shame. Every Space Wolf carries the potential for the transformation. Every warrior who receives the Canis Helix accepts the risk that the Helix may, at any point during their service, trigger the mutation that reduces them from a warrior to a beast. The risk is highest during the initial implantation, when the aspirant undergoes the trial that determines whether the Helix will bond with their biology or whether the Helix will overwhelm their humanity. The aspirants who fail the trial become Wolfen. They are taken into the wilds of Fenris and released, their bestial forms consigned to the Deathworld's wilderness, where they join the packs of creatures that populate the planet's most remote regions. The failure is not spoken of. The lost aspirants are not mourned publicly. They are absorbed into Fenris's ecosystem, becoming part of the world that made them, returning to the wilderness that the chapter's traditions honor. The transformation can also occur in battle. A Space Wolf who is pushed to the extremes of combat, who channels the Canis Helix's aggression beyond the point of control, can undergo the wolfen transformation on the battlefield, the warrior's body shifting, growing, the bones and flesh reshaping themselves into the lupine form that the helix's potential contains. The transformation is terrifying for the wolves who witness it, a reminder that the beast is always there, always waiting, always ready to consume the warrior from within. The ranks of the Space Wolves reflect the chapter's Fenrisian culture and its progression from the beast to the warrior. The Bloodclaws are the youngest, the newest, the most recently inducted warriors of the chapter. Bloodclaws are aggressive, impetuous, eager for combat in a way that reflects both the Canis Helix's fresh influence on their biology and the Fenrisian warrior culture that values boldness above caution. Bloodclaws charge. They rush. They throw themselves at the enemy with an enthusiasm that more experienced warriors find both inspiring and exhausting. Bloodclaws are not subtle. They are not tactical. They are the raw material of the Space Wolves, warriors whose aggression has not yet been tempered by the experience that transforms eagerness into effectiveness. The Bloodclaws' role in the chapter's combat doctrine is to provide the shock assault that breaks the enemy's line, to close with the enemy at maximum speed, and to engage in the melee combat that the Canis Helix's enhancements make devastating. The Space Wolves' combat doctrine is characterized by aggression tempered by cunning, a combination that reflects the hunting methods of the wolves for which the chapter is named. The wolves do not charge blindly. They study their prey. They identify weaknesses. They coordinate their approach, the pack working together to isolate the target, to cut off escape routes, and to deliver the killing blow at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The charging is what the enemy sees. The planning is what the enemy does not see. And the gap between what the enemy perceives and what the Space Wolves are actually doing is the gap in which the Space Wolves win their battles. The chapter's preferred method of engagement is the close assault, the rapid, overwhelming attack that closes the distance between the Space Wolves and their enemy before the enemy can bring their ranged weapons to bear. The Wolves excel in melee combat. Their Fenrisian warrior culture, and the Canis Helix's enhancements producing fighters whose close quarters abilities exceed those of most other Space Marine chapters. The melee preference does not mean the Space Wolves neglect ranged warfare. The chapter deploys firepower with the same pragmatism that characterizes all their tactical decisions. If ranged fire serves the objective, the Space Wolves employ ranged fire. The Longfang's heavy weapons provide the suppressive fire that pins the enemy in place, while the Bloodclaws and the Grey Hunters close the distance. The tactical flexibility that this combination produces is more sophisticated than the Space Wolves' reputation for brute force would suggest. The Wolves fight as a pack. Individual heroism is valued, but individual heroism that compromises the pack's cohesion is not. The Fenrisian warrior culture celebrates the hero, the lone warrior whose deeds inspire sagas, but the Space Wolves' military effectiveness is built on coordination, on the pack's ability to act as a single organism, each warrior aware of the other's positions and intentions, each warrior adjusting their actions to complement the pack's overall movement. The coordination is instinctive. The Canis Helix's sensory enhancements allow the Space Wolves to communicate through, means that other chapters cannot replicate. Scent, subtle vocalizations, the body language of predators who have spent their lives reading the intentions of pack mates. The communication is faster than vox traffic, more reliable than hand signals, and impossible for the enemy to intercept, because the enemy does not have the senses required to detect it. The Grey Hunters are what Bloodclaws become when they survive long enough to learn. The Grey Hunters are the Space Wolves' core warriors, experienced Space Marines whose years of service have taught them to channel the Canis Helix's aggression rather than being controlled by it. Grey Hunters are versatile, capable of the sustained, disciplined fighting that Bloodclaws lack the patience for, and their experience produces warriors who are as dangerous at range as they are in melee. The Long Fangs are the veterans, the oldest warriors, the Space Wolves, who have survived decades or centuries of combat and who have learned, through the accumulation of experience, the patience that the chapter's younger warriors lack. Longfangs are heavy weapons specialists, their years of service having taught them that there are times when the enemy is best engaged from a distance, and their patience, their willingness to wait for the right moment to deliver the killing blow, reflects the maturity that the Canis Helix's influence has not eroded. The Wolf Guard are the elite, the personal retinue of the Wolf Lord, warriors whose combat prowess and personal loyalty have earned them the honour of serving at the Wolf Lord's side. The Wolf Guard are the finest warriors that each great company produces. Space Marines whose abilities have been proven in battles that tested every aspect of their capability, and whose survival demonstrates the combination of skill, aggression, and luck that the Space Wolves consider the hallmarks of a true warrior. The Space Wolves' equipment reflects their Fenrisian origins in ways that distinguish them from every other chapter in the Adeptus Astartes. The armour is decorated with totems, pelts, runes and trophies that the warriors collect during their campaigns, producing a visual aesthetic that is less the standardised military uniformity of the Codex-compliant chapters, and more the individual, personality-driven appearance of tribal warriors who express their identity through their equipment. The frost weapons are the Space Wolves' most prized armaments. Power weapons whose blades are forged on Fenris using techniques that the Iron Priests, the chapter's tech marines, guard with a possessiveness that mirrors the Mechanicus' own secrecy. Frost blades and frost axes radiate a cold that is more than physical, a psychic chill that the weapon's crystalline structure produces through interaction with the wielder's connection to the Canis Helix. The Wolf Claws, paired lightning claws that the chapter's close combat specialists favour, are another signature weapon, and the sight of a space wolf charging into melee with wolf claws crackling is an image that the chapter's enemies learn to dread with the visceral certainty of experience. The Iron Priests serve the same function as Tech Marines in other chapters, but the Iron Priest's relationship with the Mechanicus is more distant, more adversarial, and more independent than the relationship that other chapters' Tech Marines maintain. The Iron Priests learn their craft on Mars, as all Tech Marines do, but they return to Fenris with a Fenrisian attitude toward technology that the Mechanicus finds both refreshing and infuriating. The Iron Priests view technology as a tool, not a deity, and the pragmatism that this attitude produces leads the Iron Priests to modify, adapt, and improvise with their equipment in ways that the Mechanicus' orthodoxy would normally prohibit. The result is a chapter whose equipment works, that is maintained with competence and creativity, and that bears the distinctive modifications that the Iron Priest's Fenrisian pragmatism produces. A Space Wolf's vehicle does not look like an Ultramarine's vehicle. A Space Wolf's vehicle looks like a vehicle that has been adapted by warriors who value function over form and who are not afraid to deviate from the template when the template does not serve their needs. The Thunderwolf Cavalry are the Space Wolves' most distinctive warriors, Space Marines who ride the massive Thunderwolves of Fenris into battle. The Thunderwolves are the largest and most aggressive of Fenris's lupine predators, creatures whose size and strength allow them to serve as mounts for fully armoured Space Marines. The relationship between rider and mount is not domestication. The Thunderwolves are not tame. The relationship is a partnership, a bond between predators whose mutual respect produces a cavalry force that is devastating on the battlefield. Ragnar Blackmane is the youngest Wolf Lord in the chapter's history, a warrior whose meteoric rise through the ranks reflects both his extraordinary combat abilities and the Fenrisian culture's emphasis on demonstrated prowess over accumulated seniority. Ragnar's story is the Space Wolves' story in miniature. A Fenrisian tribesman, recruited into the chapter after proving himself in combat, transformed by the Canis Helix, tested through the trials that every aspirant must endure, and elevated through a combination of courage, skill, and the aggressive initiative that the Space Wolves value above all other qualities. Ragnar became Wolflord after tracking down and killing the Chaos Champion who had slain his predecessor, Beric Thunderfist. The Vengeance Mission, a hunt that took Ragnar across multiple star systems and that culminated in a duel that tested every ability the young warrior possessed, earned Ragnar the respect of his great company, and the title that made him the youngest Wolflord in 10,000 years. Ragnar has been central to some of the chapter's most significant recent events. He led the effort to gather the returning Wolfen, the warriors of the 13th Company who had reappeared in the galaxy after millennia of absence. He fought against the Dark Angels when the rivalry between the two chapters threatened to erupt into fratricide. He confronted the Thousand Sons' attempts to weaponize the curse of the Wolfen against the chapter, stopping the sorcerer Maddox from transforming the entire chapter into bestial monsters. Ragnar Blackmane also decapitated Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the greatest orc warlord in the galaxy, during an engagement that demonstrated the young Wolflord's extraordinary combat abilities. The decapitation did not kill Gazkul permanently, the orc warlord's Mad Doc reattaching the head to a new body, but the feat cemented Ragnar's reputation as one of the most dangerous close combat warriors in the Imperium. Njal Stormcaller is the chapter's most powerful rune priest, a psyker whose command of Fenris's elemental forces exceeds anything that the chapter's other psykers can produce. Njal calls storms. He summons lightning. He channels the power that the Space Wolves call the world's spirit into destructive manifestations that devastate the battlefield and that demonstrate with uncomfortable clarity the potency of the psychic abilities that the Space Wolves insist are not sorcery. The Wolf Priests are unique to the Space Wolves, a role that combines the functions that other chapters split between chaplains and apothecaries. The Wolf Priest is a spiritual leader, a medical specialist, a recruiter, and a keeper of the chapter's traditions, all combined in a single warrior whose responsibilities span the full range of the chapter's non-combat needs. The dual role produces a figure whose authority within the chapter is second only to the Wolf Lords and the Great Wolf. The Wolf Priest ministers to the warrior's spiritual needs, maintaining the Fenrisian traditions that sustain the chapter's identity. The Wolf Priest monitors the warrior's physical health, watching for the signs of the Wolfen transformation that the Canis Helix can trigger, managing the genetic instability that every Space Wolf carries. The Wolf Priest recruits the aspirants, travelling to Fenris's tribal battlefields to identify the young warriors whose potential marks them for selection. The Wolf Priest's role in managing the curse of the Wolfen is the most sensitive of their duties. The Wolf Priests monitor every warrior in the chapter for signs of the transformation, watching for the subtle behavioural changes, the physical mutations, the psychological shifts that indicate that the Canis Helix's influence is overwhelming the warrior's ability to control it. When a warrior begins to turn, the Wolf Priest faces a decision that no other chapter's officers must make. Whether the warrior can be saved, whether the transformation can be arrested through the spiritual and medical techniques that the Wolf Priests have developed over 10 millennia, or whether the warrior is beyond saving and must be released into the wilds of Fenris to complete the transformation in isolation. The decision is agonizing. The warrior who is turning is a brother, a packmate, a fellow son of Russ whose courage and loyalty are not in question. The transformation is not the warrior's fault. The curse is a flaw in the gene seed, a consequence of the Canis Helix's design, and the warrior who succumbs to it is a victim rather than a failure. The Wolf Priests carry this weight. The weight of watching brothers transform. The weight of deciding when a brother is beyond saving. The weight of maintaining the chapter's functionality in the face of a genetic flaw that could, if left unmanaged, consume the chapter from within. The chapter's response to the Wolfen curse has evolved over the millennia, the Wolf Priests developing techniques and protocols that allow the chapter to manage the risk without eliminating it entirely. The most important protocol is the Watch. The wolf priests observe every warrior in the chapter continuously, monitoring for the behavioral signs that precede the transformation, increased aggression beyond the chapter's already elevated baseline, a tendency to vocalizing growls rather than words, a restlessness that manifests as pacing, circling, the unconscious adoption of lupine body language that signals the Canis Helix's influence asserting itself. When the signs appear, the wolf priest intervenes. The intervention is spiritual rather than medical, because the transformation is not a disease that can be treated with pharmaceuticals, but a genetic potential that must be managed through the warrior's own willpower. The wolf priest counsels the warrior. The wolf priest reminds the warrior of their human identity, of their duty, of the pack that needs them. The wolf priest uses the chapter's traditions, the sagas, the rituals, the cultural infrastructure that 10,000 years of experience have developed to anchor the warrior's human consciousness and to prevent the beast from gaining the upper hand. The protocol works most of the time. The warriors who respond to the wolf priest's intervention maintain their humanity. The beast pushed back below the surface, the Canis Helix's influence contained by the cultural defenses that the chapter has built around it. The protocol fails. Sometimes, and when it fails, the warrior transforms, and the wolf priest makes the decision, and the pack loses a brother, and the loss is mourned in silence, because the chapter does not discuss its greatest shame. The weight of watching brothers transform. The weight of deciding when a brother is beyond saving. The weight of maintaining the chapter's functionality in the face of a genetic flaw that could, if left unmanaged, consume the chapter from within. Ulrich the Slayer is the chapter's wolf high priest, the spiritual leader whose duties include the recruitment and training of new space wolves, the maintenance of the chapter's traditions, and the counsel of the Great Wolf on matters of faith and culture. Ulrich is old, ancient, by the standards of space marines who are not entombed in dreadnought sarcophagi. He has served the chapter for centuries, and his longevity, combined with his role as the keeper of the chapter's traditions, gives him an authority within the Space Wolves that rivals the Great Wolf's own. The Space Wolves' sense of humour is another quality that distinguishes them from other chapters. The Space Wolves laugh. They joke. They engage in the kind of boisterous, physical, occasionally cruel humour that warrior cultures produce when the warriors are confident enough in their strength to find amusement in the galaxy's absurdities. The humour is not frivolous. The humour is a coping mechanism, a psychological tool that the chapter's Fenrisian culture has developed to manage the stress of perpetual warfare. A warrior who can laugh at the galaxy's horrors is a warrior whose psychological resilience exceeds that of a warrior who absorbs the horrors without processing them. The laughter releases pressure. The jokes create bonds. The humour sustains the pack's cohesion in environments that would shatter formations whose culture does not accommodate emotional expression. The humour also serves a tactical function. The Space Wolves' reputation for ferocity is well known. The Space Wolves' reputation for humour is less well known, and the unexpected appearance of humour in a force that the enemy expected to encounter as grim, silent killers creates a psychological effect that the humour's practitioners find deeply satisfying. A space wolf who charges into battle howling a war cry and laughing simultaneously is a space wolf who has achieved the ideal that the chapter's culture celebrates. The warrior who is so confident in their strength, so comfortable with the violence they are about to inflict, that the violence is a source of joy rather than stress. Lucas the Trickster is the Space Wolves' wild card, a warrior whose irreverence, whose refusal to take anything seriously, whose habit of undermining authority and embarrassing superiors makes him simultaneously the chapter's most entertaining and most infuriating member. Lucas is a Bloodclaw who has never been promoted, not because he lacks the ability, but because his personality is so aggressively anti-authoritarian that no Wolf Lord will accept him into a position of responsibility. Lucas fights with a ferocity that matches any warrior in the chapter. He also fights dirty, employing tricks, distractions, and methods that the chapter's more traditional warriors consider beneath a Space Wolf's dignity. His most famous modification is a stasis bomb implanted in his chest, designed to trap anyone who kills him in a permanent stasis field, ensuring that Lucas gets the last laugh even in death. The 13th Company is the Space Wolves' most mysterious formation, a great company that followed Russ into the Eye of Terror and that was believed lost for 10,000 years. The warriors of the 13th Company were consumed by the Wolfen transformation during their time in the Warp. The Eye of Terror's influence, the sustained exposure to the Warp's energies, triggered the Canis Helix's mutation across the entire company, transforming every warrior into a Wolfen. The transformation should have destroyed them. The mutation should have consumed their consciousness, reducing them to the same bestial state that afflicts the aspirants who fail the Canis Helix's trial. The Wolfen form itself is a horror that the Space Wolves have learned to incorporate into their combat doctrine. The Wolfen is taller than a standard Space Marine, broader, more heavily muscled, with elongated limbs that end in claws capable of rending Terminator armor. The Wolfen's face is a hybrid, a blend of human and lupine features that produces a visage of terrifying ferocity, elongated jaws filled with teeth that can bite through ceramite, eyes that glow with an inner light that reflects the Canis Helix's influence, a body that is covered in coarse fur that provides an additional layer of protection against the cold and the enemy's weapons. The Wolfen fight with a ferocity that exceeds even the Space Wolves' already formidable standard. The Wolfen do not use ranged weapons. The Wolfen close with the enemy at maximum speed, covering ground with a bounding, lupine gait that outpaces conventional infantry, and engage in melee combat that is less fighting and more predation. The Wolfen's instincts driving them to target the enemy's weakest points with the precision of natural hunters. The Wolfen are not mindless. This is the detail that separates the Wolfen of the 13th Company from the lost aspirants who fail the trial of Morkai. The Wolfen who have retained their consciousness can follow orders, can coordinate with other warriors, can exercise the tactical judgment that separates a warrior from a beast. The consciousness is buried beneath the bestial instincts, accessible but not dominant. A human mind operating within a body that is no longer human, and whose instincts are no longer human. The experience of being a Wolfen is described by those who have undergone the transformation and recovered as the most terrifying experience of their lives. The warrior is present, conscious, aware of what is happening. The warrior can feel the beast rising, can feel the instincts overwhelming the rational mind, can feel the body changing, the bones shifting, the flesh reshaping itself into a form that the warrior's consciousness did not choose and cannot control. The warrior watches from behind eyes that are no longer entirely their own as the body charges into combat, tears into the enemy, kills with a savagery that the warrior's human personality would find horrifying. And the worst part? The warrior enjoys it. The Canis Helix's influence produces a euphoria during combat that the warrior's human consciousness cannot resist. A flood of neurochemical satisfaction that rewards the violence with pleasure and that makes the beast's behavior feel, in the moment, like the most natural thing in the universe. The recovery, when it comes, brings shame. The warrior who returns from the Wolfen state remembers what they did, remembers the joy they felt while doing it, and the memory is a wound that the warrior carries in silence. Because the Space Wolves do not discuss the curse openly, and because admitting to the pleasure that the beast provides is admitting to a vulnerability that the chapter's warrior culture does not accommodate. The 13th Company survived. Their consciousness persisted within their Wolfen forms, the warriors' identities sustained by a combination of willpower, pack bonds, and the warp's own paradoxical influence, which preserved the warriors in their mutated state rather than allowing the mutation to complete the destruction of their humanity. The 13th Company fought in the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years. 10,000 years of warfare against the daemons and the chaos warbands that inhabit the warp's domain. 10,000 years of hunting and killing in an environment that would have destroyed any other military formation within days. They return. In the closing years of the 41st millennium, the Wolfen of the 13th Company began appearing in real space, emerging from warp storms and combat zones with a frequency that the Space Wolves could not explain, and that the chapter's wolf priests interpreted as a sign of Russ's imminent return. The return of the Wolfen created a crisis within the chapter. The Wolfen's presence triggered the Canis Helix's instability in the Space Wolves who encountered them. The proximity to the transformed warriors, awakening the beast within the chapter's regular warriors and pushing them toward their own Wolfen transformations. The crisis threatened to consume the chapter from within. The genetic flaw that had always lurked in the Space Wolves' gene seeds suddenly activated by the 13th Company's return. Ragnar Blackmane led the effort to gather the Wolfen and to bring them to Fenris, where the chapter could study the phenomenon and where the wolf priests could attempt to manage the crisis that the Wolfen's return had precipitated. The effort brought the Space Wolves into conflict with the Thousand Sons, who attempted to exploit the crisis by amplifying the Canis Helix's instability through sorcery, and with the Dark Angels, whose own secrets and whose rivalry with the Space Wolves complicated the situation beyond what simple military action could resolve. Magnus the Red attacked Fenris again during this period, the Daemon Primarch leading the Thousand Sons in an assault that exploited the chapter's distraction and that nearly destroyed the Space Wolves' homeworld. The attack was devastating. Fenris was scarred. The Fang was damaged. The chapter suffered casualties that would have crippled a less resilient formation. The Space Wolves survived. They have always survived. The chapter's resilience, the combination of Fenrisian stubbornness and genetic enhancement that produces warriors who refuse to die regardless of the circumstances, has carried the Space Wolves through crises that would have destroyed other chapters, and the survival, each time, reinforces the chapter's belief in its own indestructibility. The Space Wolves' relationships with other Space Marine chapters are shaped by the chapter's personality and by the historical events that have defined the Space Wolves' place within the Adeptus Astartes. The rivalry with the Dark Angels is the most famous interchapter rivalry in the lore, a feud that stretches back to the Great Crusade and that has produced conflicts that range from formal dueling to near fratricidal violence. The rivalry's origins lie in the relationship between Russ and the Lion, L. Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, whose mutual respect was complicated by a competition that neither Primarch could quite bring themselves to resolve. The rivalry produces a tradition of formal combat between the two chapters, champions from each chapter fighting duels that serve as a pressure valve for the tension that the rivalry produces. The duels are not meant to be lethal, though accidents have occurred, and the tradition has survived for 10,000 years, sustained by the institutional memory of both chapters and by the Fenrisian love of competition that makes the Space Wolves incapable of walking away from a challenge. The relationship with the Grey Knights is complicated by the months of shame. The Grey Knights fought alongside the Space Wolves at Armageddon and then against the Space Wolves in the conflict's aftermath, and the dual relationship, ally and adversary, has produced a dynamic between the two chapters that is characterized by mutual respect, mutual wariness, and the uncomfortable knowledge that they have killed each other's warriors. The Space Wolves' relationship with Guilliman's Ultramarines and the broader Codex-compliant chapters is one of polite resistance. The Space Wolves acknowledge the Ultramarines' contributions to the Imperium. They acknowledge Guilliman's genius as a strategist and an administrator. They refuse to reorganize themselves according to Guilliman's Codex, and the refusal, maintained for 10,000 years through the simple expedient of ignoring the Codex's prescriptions, is the most persistent act of institutional defiance in the Adeptus Astartes history. The return of Guilliman during the Era Indomitus produced an interesting dynamic. The Primarch who wrote the Codex was confronted with a chapter that had spent 10 millennia refusing to follow it, and Guilliman's response was pragmatic rather than punitive. The Ultramarines Primarch acknowledged that the Space Wolves' methods, however irregular, produced results, and that the results mattered more than the methods. The Great Rift's opening during the era Indomitus brought the Space Wolves into contact with threats that tested the chapter's capabilities to their limits. The warp storms that the Rift produced disrupted the chapter's operations, scattering the great companies, severing communications between the Wolf Lords and the Fang, and forcing each great company to operate independently in a way that the chapter's decentralized structure was uniquely suited to handle. The Space Wolves' adaptability during the Rift's opening was a vindication of the chapter's organizational philosophy. While Codex-compliant chapters struggled to function without the centralized command structures that the Codex prescribed, the Space Wolves' great companies, each one a self-sufficient fighting force led by a Wolf Lord whose authority was absolute within his domain, continued to operate effectively, the chapter's independence becoming an asset rather than a liability in an environment where centralized command was impossible. Grimnar's leadership during the crisis demonstrated the Old Wolf's tactical acumen. The Great Wolf coordinated the chapter's dispersed forces through a combination of astropathic communication, when available, and the intuitive understanding that 8 centuries of command had given him of how his Wolf Lords would respond to various situations. Grimnar did not need to micromanage. He knew his Wolf Lords. He trusted their judgment. He trusted the pack. The Primaris Marines posed a challenge for the Space Wolves. The new warriors, created by Archmagos Belisarius Cawl using Guillemon's genetic template, were initially viewed with suspicion by the Space Wolves, whose culture valued the traditional methods of recruitment and transformation that the chapter had maintained since Russ's era. The Primaris Marines did not undergo the traditional Fenrisian trials. They did not face the trial of Morkai in the same way that the chapter's traditional warriors did. The Space Wolves adapted. Grudgingly, the chapter's pragmatism, the same Fenrisian practicality that allows the Space Wolves to function in the galaxy's most hostile environments, eventually overcame the chapter's cultural conservatism, and the Primaris Marines were integrated into the great companies, their enhanced abilities accepted as a useful addition to the chapter's capabilities, even if the method of their creation violated the traditions that the chapter held sacred. The Space Wolves' strategic value to the Imperium extends beyond their military capabilities. The chapter serves as a check on the Imperium's own institutions, a force whose independence and whose willingness to defy institutional authority prevents the Imperium's bureaucratic apparatus from operating without accountability. The Inquisition knows this. The Administratum knows this. The High Lords of Terror, who govern the Imperium in the Emperor's name, understand that the Space Wolves' existence serves a function that transcends the chapter's role as a military force. The Wolves are the conscience that the Imperium's institutions would prefer to silence, but that the Imperium's survival may require. An Imperium without the Space Wolves is an Imperium without opposition, an Imperium whose institutions can operate without challenge, without accountability, without the knowledge that a chapter of savage, independent warriors will intervene when the institution's actions cross the line between governance and tyranny. The line is blurry. The Space Wolves' definition of tyranny does not always match the Imperium's definition of necessity, and the conflict between the two definitions has produced crises that have weakened both the chapter and the institutions it opposes. But the conflict is productive. In the same way that all productive conflict is productive, it forces both parties to examine their positions, to justify their actions, to demonstrate that the authority they claim is exercised in the service of the people they govern, rather than in the service of the institutions themselves. The Imperium is stronger because the Space Wolves exist to challenge it. The Space Wolves are stronger because the Imperium exists to challenge them. The relationship is adversarial, unresolvable, and essential, a perpetual tension that prevents either party from degenerating into the complacency that the galaxy's threats cannot afford. The Space Wolves have fought in every major Imperial conflict of the last 10 millennia, their great companies deploying to fronts that span the galaxy, their warriors earning sagas in campaigns whose names fill the chapter's records. The defense of the Cadian Gates saw the Space Wolves fighting alongside the Imperium's forces against Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. Grimnar was selected as supreme commander of the defending Imperial forces, a designation that reflected the Old Wolf's tactical reputation and the respect that even the Space Wolves' institutional critics granted to Grimnar's ability to command multi-force operations. The fall of Cadia was a blow that the Space Wolves felt personally. The fortress world's destruction, the opening of the Great Rift, the devastation that Abaddon's crusade inflicted on the Imperium's defences, produced a crisis that the Space Wolves met with characteristic aggression the great companies deployed to the Rift's edges, the Wolf Lords leading their warriors into the gap that Cadia's fall had created, fighting to hold the line that the fortress world had once anchored. The Plague Wars, Mortarian's assault on Ultramar, saw Space Wolves' forces fighting alongside Guilliman's defenders, the Sons of Russ and the Sons of Guilliman, setting aside their institutional differences to face a common enemy whose threat transcended the bureaucratic rivalries that normally defined the two chapters' relationship. The Era Indomitus finds the Space Wolves doing what the Space Wolves have always done, fighting. Grimnar leads the chapter in campaigns across the galaxy, the Old Wolf's tactical acumen and personal ferocity, undimmed by the centuries of service that would have exhausted a lesser warrior. The great companies are deployed to fronts that span the Imperium, each Wolf Lord leading their warriors in the independent, aggressive, initiative-driven campaigns that the Space Wolves' culture demands. The Space Wolves have fought every major Xenos threat that the galaxy produces, and the chapter's approach to each threat reflects the Fenrisian pragmatism that characterizes their tactical doctrine. Against the Orcs, the Space Wolves fight with a ferocity that matches the Greenskins' own, the Wolves' aggression meeting the Orcs' aggression in engagements that produce the kind of brutal close-quarters combat that both sides prefer. The Space Wolves respect the Orcs, in the way that one predator respects another, not with admiration but with the acknowledgement that the enemy is dangerous, and that underestimating the enemy is a mistake that the Wolves of Fenris would not make. Against the Tyranids, the Space Wolves adapt their tactics to address the swarm's overwhelming numbers, using hit-and-run attacks, targeted strikes against synapse creatures, and the kind of mobile, aggressive warfare that the Fenrisian cavalry tradition makes possible. The Thunderwolf cavalry are particularly effective against Tyranid forces, their speed and their close combat capabilities allowing them to strike at the swarm's vulnerable points and to withdraw before the swarm can bring its numerical advantage to bear. Against the forces of chaos, the Space Wolves fight with a personal hatred that exceeds the institutional hostility that other chapters display. The heresy is not ancient history for the Space Wolves. The heresy is a living wound, a betrayal that the chapter feels personally because the chapter's Primarch was personally betrayed. And the hatred that the betrayal produces is the fuel that drives the Space Wolves' anti-chaos campaigns with an intensity that borders on obsession. The Great Rift has complicated the Space Wolves' operations, the vast warp storm that bisects the galaxy, disrupting the communications and the logistics that the chapter requires. The Space Wolves have adapted, as they always adapt, their Fenrisian pragmatism, producing solutions to problems that more rigid chapters would find insurmountable. The Space Wolves are what the Emperor made them. This is the statement that the chapter's defenders and critics both agree on, though they interpret the statement differently. The defenders see the Space Wolves as the Emperor's finest creation, loyal warriors whose personal bond with the Emperor transcends the institutional loyalty that other chapters feel toward the Imperium's structures. The Space Wolves are loyal to the Emperor's vision, to the principles that the Emperor embodied, to the values that the Emperor's crusade was meant to establish. The Space Wolves' defiance of the Imperium's institutions is not disloyalty. It is the highest form of loyalty, the loyalty that serves the spirit of the law rather than its letter. The critics see the Space Wolves as a liability, an undisciplined, uncontrollable chapter whose refusal to submit to institutional authority undermines the Imperium's ability to respond to threats in a coordinated, efficient manner. The Space Wolves' independence is not loyalty. It is arrogance, the presumption that a single chapter can determine, on its own authority, what the Emperor would want and what the Emperor would condemn. Both perspectives contain truth. Both perspectives miss the point. The Space Wolves are wolves. Wolves do not serve institutions. Wolves serve the pack. The pack is the chapter. The pack leader is the Great Wolf. And the alpha of all alphas, the figure whose authority the pack recognizes above all others, is the Emperor. The institutional structures that have accumulated around the Emperor's original vision, the Inquisition, the Administratum, the High Lords, are not the pack. They are not the Emperor. They are the accumulated detritus of 10,000 years of bureaucratic expansion. And the Space Wolves' refusal to submit to their authority is not defiance of the Emperor. It is defiance of the things that have attached themselves to the Emperor's legacy and that claim, with varying degrees of legitimacy, to speak with the Emperor's voice. The Space Wolves do not recognize the legitimacy of that claim. The Space Wolves recognize only the Emperor himself, and the Emperor, silent on his golden throne, does not contradict them. The Space Wolves occupy a unique position within the Warhammer 40,000 setting because they are simultaneously the most sympathetic and the most dangerous of the Imperium's defenders. They are sympathetic because they care. In a universe where every institution has been corrupted by bureaucracy, by paranoia, by the accumulated cynicism of 10,000 years of unending war, the Space Wolves retain the capacity for empathy that other chapters have trained out of their warriors. The Space Wolves protect civilians not because doctrine requires it, but because the warriors remember, at some level, that the Canis Helix has not eroded, what it is to be human. They are dangerous because caring makes them unpredictable. An institution that cares about individuals is an institution that will defy orders to protect individuals, and the defiance, however morally justified, undermines the institutional discipline that the Imperium's survival requires. The Imperium cannot afford Space Marines who think for themselves. The Space Wolves think for themselves, and the tension between what the Imperium needs and what the Space Wolves are is the tension that has defined the chapter's existence for 10,000 years. The setting uses the Space Wolves to ask a question that it does not answer. Is it better to have soldiers who obey without question, who follow orders regardless of their moral content, who subordinate their conscience to the chain of command? Or is it better to have soldiers who judge, who evaluate, who refuse to participate in atrocities even when the atrocities are ordered by legitimate authority? The Imperium's answer is the first. The Imperium needs obedience. The Imperium's survival depends on the coordinated, disciplined, unquestioning execution of orders across 1,000,000 worlds, and the Space Wolves' habit of evaluating orders before following them is a luxury that the galaxy's existential threats do not allow. The Space Wolves' answer is the second. The Space Wolves believe that a soldier who obeys without question is not a soldier, but a tool, and that a tool that can be used for atrocity as easily as it can be used for defense is a tool that has already been corrupted, regardless of the flag it flies under. Neither answer is wrong. Neither answer is right. The tension is the point. The thematic significance of the Space Wolves in the Warhammer 40,000 setting extends beyond their role as savage warriors. The Space Wolves represent a philosophical position within the Imperium, the argument that the Imperium's institutions have betrayed the Emperor's original vision, that the bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium serves itself rather than the humanity it was designed to protect, and that true loyalty to the Emperor requires the willingness to defy the Emperor's servants when those servants have lost their way. The Space Wolves' relationship with the mortal population of the Imperium is different from that of other chapters, and the difference reveals something fundamental about the Space Wolves' character. Most Space Marine chapters maintain a distance from the civilians they protect. The Ultramarines govern their realm of Ultramar with the efficiency of administrators. The Dark Angels operate in secrecy, their interactions with civilians limited to the bare minimum that operational necessity demands. The Iron Hands view unaugmented humans with a disdain that borders on contempt. The Space Wolves drink with them. This is not an exaggeration. The Space Wolves' Fenrisian culture, the tribal warrior ethos that values community and celebration alongside combat prowess, produces Space Marines who view the mortal population not as subjects to be governed or assets to be managed, but as members of the broader pack, the extended community that the Space Wolves exist to protect. The protection is sincere. The Space Wolves' defense of the Armageddon survivors during the months of shame was not an abstract political statement. It was personal. The Space Wolves had fought alongside those soldiers. They had shared the battlefield with them. They had watched them bleed and die in defense of the Imperium and the Fenrisian warrior code. The cultural values that the chapter has maintained for 10 millennia demanded that the warriors who had proven their courage be treated with the honor that their courage had earned. The Inquisition's decision to purge the survivors violated every principle that the Space Wolves held sacred. The decision treated courageous warriors as contaminated waste, disposable assets whose sacrifice was less important than the institutional security concerns that the Order Malleus had identified. The Space Wolves' response was not calculated political resistance. It was the reflexive, instinctive reaction of warriors who had been told that the people they had fought to protect were now to be destroyed by the institutions that were supposed to protect them. This instinct, the reflexive defense of the pack's weakest members against threats from above, is the quality that makes the Space Wolves simultaneously the Imperium's most valuable chapter and its most difficult. A chapter that protects civilians from the Imperium's own institutions is a chapter that undermines the Imperium's ability to enforce its authority. A chapter that prioritizes the welfare of individuals over the security of institutions is a chapter that creates precedents that, if adopted by other chapters, would fundamentally alter the relationship between the Adeptus Astartes and the Imperium's governing structures. The Space Wolves do not care about the precedent. The Space Wolves care about the people. And the caring, however inconvenient for the Imperium's administrators, is the thing that makes the Space Wolves what they are. The Space Wolves are the Imperium's conscience, not its moral conscience, because the Space Wolves are not moral paragons. They are savage, violent, sometimes cruel in the execution of their duties. But they are honest. They do not dress their violence in the language of piety. They do not pretend that their wars are holy. They fight because fighting is what the Emperor built them to do, and they protect the Imperium's citizens because protecting the Imperium's citizens is the purpose that the Emperor assigned to all Space Marines, a purpose that the Inquisition's purges and the Administratum's indifference have betrayed. The months of shame defined this position. The Space Wolves' defense of the Armageddon survivors was not merely a military action. It was a moral statement, a declaration that the Imperium's institutions do not have the right to destroy the citizens they are supposed to protect, regardless of the justifications they offer and regardless of the authority they claim. The statement cost the Space Wolves. The statement cost lives, ships, resources that the chapter could not easily replace. The statement earned the Space Wolves the enmity of the Inquisition and the distrust of the broader institutional apparatus that governs the Imperium. The Space Wolves made the statement anyway, because the statement was right, because the people of Armageddon deserved better, because the Emperor who had built the Space Wolves to protect humanity would not have wanted his executioners to stand aside while his Inquisition murdered the soldiers who had fought in his name. This is what the Space Wolves are. Not the noble wolves of heraldry, not the dignified predators of myth. The other kind. The kind that hunts in the dark, the kind that protects the pack, the kind that bares its teeth at anything, anything, that threatens the things it has chosen to defend. The Space Wolves are savage. The Space Wolves are loyal. The Space Wolves are the Emperor's most dangerous chapter, not because of their military capabilities, which are formidable, but because of their willingness to turn those capabilities against the Imperium's own institutions when those institutions fail the people they are meant to serve. The Emperor built them to be his executioners. The Emperor pointed, and the wolves struck. 10,000 years later, the Emperor is silent, the finger no longer points, and the wolves are left to decide on their own what needs killing. They have decided, they have always decided, and their decisions, right or wrong, wise or reckless, are made with the absolute conviction of predators who trust their instincts above all else. The Space Wolves' legacy is not measured in worlds conquered or enemies defeated. The Space Wolves' legacy is measured in people saved, in the soldiers who came home from Armageddon because the Space Wolves refused to let the Inquisition silence them, in the civilians who survived the Chaos invasions because the Space Wolves deployed faster than the bureaucratic authorization process would have allowed, in the ordinary, unremarkable, historically insignificant people who are alive because a chapter of savage, feral, stubbornly independent warriors decided that their lives mattered. The Imperium does not count these people. The Administratum does not record these individual salvations. The institutional machinery of the Imperium processes populations, not persons, and the Space Wolves' insistence on seeing persons where the Imperium sees populations is the chapter's most radical and most subversive quality. The wolves of Fenris are howling. They have been howling for 10,000 years, since the day their Primarch walked into the Eye of Terror and left them to guard the Imperium in his absence. The howling carries across the void, through the warp storms and the daemonic incursions, and the endless grinding wars that define the 41st millennium and beyond. The howl is a warning. The howl is a promise. The howl is the sound that the enemies of the Imperium hear in their nightmares, the sound that tells them that the wolves are coming, that the wolves are always coming, that the wolves will never stop coming, because the wolves do not stop, the wolves do not rest, the wolves do not die until the fight is finished and the pack is safe. The Great Hunts are the Space Wolves' most sacred expeditions, campaigns that the chapter periodically launches to search for their missing Primarch. The Great Hunts are not conventional military operations. They are pilgrimages, spiritual journeys that take the chapter's warriors to the galaxy's most remote and dangerous regions in search of any trace of Leman Russ. The Great Hunts have been launched multiple times across the 10 millennia since Russ's disappearance, each one driven by visions, omens, or the discovery of artifacts that the chapter believes may lead to their Primarch's location. Each hunt has returned without finding Russ, and each return has deepened the chapter's determination to continue searching. The hunts produce legends. The warriors who participate in the Great Hunts encounter threats and wonders that would fill the sagas of ordinary campaigns, and the stories that the hunt's survivors bring back to the Fang become part of the chapter's mythology. Tales of distant worlds and impossible enemies, and the persistent, tantalizing traces of the Wolf King's passage that keep the chapter's hope alive. Some within the chapter believe that Russ entered the Eye of Terror seeking the Tree of Life, a mythical source of healing that could restore the Emperor to full consciousness. The belief is unverified, based on fragmentary records and oral traditions that have been passed down through 10,000 years of retelling, but the belief sustains the chapter's hope that their Primarch's disappearance was purposeful rather than final. Magnus the Red knows where Russ is, or so the lore suggests. The Daemon Primarch, whose enmity with the Space Wolves spans 10 millennia, possesses knowledge of the Wolf King's location that he has refused to share, holding the information as a weapon whose deployment he is saving for the moment of maximum impact. The knowledge is a taunt. The knowledge is a threat. The knowledge is the Daemon Primarch's way of reminding the Space Wolves that their greatest enemy holds the key to their greatest hope, and that the key will not be turned without a price. Leman Russ promised to return. At the Wolf Time, at the hour of the galaxy's greatest crisis, the Space Wolves believe the promise with a faith that exceeds anything the Ecclesiarchy can produce, because the promise was made by their father, by the Alpha, by the only being besides the Emperor who has ever earned the Wolves' unconditional trust. The Wolf Time may be coming. The Great Rift has torn the galaxy apart. The Daemon Primarchs are rising. The Tyranids are advancing. The Necrons are awakening. The threats that the Imperium faces in the era Indomitus are threats that exceed anything the galaxy has previously endured, and the Space Wolves, who measure the galaxy's crises by the standard that their sagas provide, believe that the current era matches the prophecies that their father left behind. If the Wolf Time comes, Russ will return. The Wolf King will emerge from whatever corner of the galaxy or the warp has held him for 10 millennia, and the Space Wolves will be waiting. Every warrior, every great company, every Wolf Lord, and Bloodclaw, and Longfang, and Grey Hunter, ready to follow their father into the final battle. Until then, the Wolves hunt. The Wolves fight. The Wolves protect the pack and kill the enemies of the Emperor and tell their sagas in the Great Hall of the Fang, and drink their mead and sharpen their blades and wait. They are very good at waiting. They have been waiting for 10,000 years. The waiting has not softened them. The waiting has sharpened them. The millennia of service honing the chapter's edge until the edge is as keen as the frost blades that the Iron Priests forge in the Fang's armories. The waiting has purpose. The waiting is not passive. The Space Wolves do not sit in the Fang and stare at the stars hoping for Russ's return. The Space Wolves fight. They hunt. They protect. They do, every day, the work that the Emperor built them to do, and the work sustains them, fills the gap that the Primarch's absence has created, gives the chapter a purpose that transcends the waiting and that makes the waiting bearable. Every Bloodclaw who charges into battle for the first time carries Russ's legacy. Every Grey Hunter who holds the line carries Russ's stubbornness. Every Longfang who delivers the killing shot carries Russ's patience. Every Wolf Lord who leads their great company into the fight carries Russ's authority. The Primarch is gone. The Primarch is everywhere. They are very good at waiting. They have been waiting for 10,000 years. They are better at fighting. They have been fighting for longer, and the fighting has produced a chapter that is, by any metric the Imperium cares to apply, one of the most effective military forces in the galaxy. The Space Wolves' combat record spans 10 millennia and includes victories that other chapters would consider impossible. The defense of the Fang against the Thousand Suns sustained for 3 years with a skeleton garrison. The months of shame, in which the Space Wolves fought the Inquisition, the Grey Knights and the Red Hunters simultaneously and emerged, battered, but unbroken. The First War for Armageddon, in which 300 Space Wolves fought alongside the Grey Knights to banish a Daemon Primarch. The victories are not achieved through superior technology or superior numbers. The Space Wolves' equipment is standard Astartes equipment, modified by the Iron Priests, but not fundamentally different from what other chapters field. The Space Wolves' numbers are limited to the 1,000 warriors that the Codex prescribes, supplemented by the Great Company's support elements, but not exceeding the numerical ceiling that all chapters share. The victories are achieved through the qualities that the Space Wolves bring to every engagement: aggression, resilience, the pack coordination that the Canis Helix enables, and the sheer, overwhelming, irresistible force of will that 1,000 Fenrisian warriors generate when they are committed to an objective. The force of will is the Space Wolves' most powerful weapon. Not the bolters, not the frost blades, Not the Thunderwolf cavalry, or the Longfang's heavy weapons, or the psychic storms that the rune priests conjure. The will. The refusal to yield, the stubbornness that the Fenrisian environment breeds into every warrior who survives it, the absolute, uncompromising, genetically reinforced conviction that the pack does not break, the pack does not run, the pack does not stop fighting until the fight is won or the last wolf falls. The enemies of the Imperium have learned this. The enemies of the Imperium have learned that engaging the Space Wolves is not merely a military challenge, but a contest of wills, and that the Space Wolves' will is forged in the fires of a death world, tempered by 10,000 years of warfare and sustained by the promise of a Primarch who swore to return. The enemies of the Imperium have learned to fear the Howl. They have learned that the Howl precedes the charge, and the charge precedes the killing, and the killing does not stop until the wolves have finished their work. The enemies have learned that the Space Wolves do not take prisoners unless taking prisoners serves the pack's interests, that the Space Wolves do not accept surrender unless the surrender is accompanied by the kind of genuine contrition that warriors can smell in the way that wolves smell fear. The enemies have learned that fighting the Space Wolves is not like fighting other Space Marines. Other chapters are soldiers, professional, disciplined, efficient, their warfare governed by doctrine and protocol and the standardized procedures that the Codex Astartes prescribes. The Space Wolves are hunters. The difference is subtle but significant. A soldier fights the enemy in front of them. A hunter pursues the prey across whatever terrain the hunt requires, adapting, tracking, following the prey's trail with a persistence that the prey cannot outlast. The Space Wolves pursue. The Space Wolves do not give up. The Space Wolves track their prey across star systems, across sectors, across the vast dark distances that separate the Imperium's worlds, and the tracking continues until the prey is found and the hunt concludes with the kill that the wolves have been working toward since the hunt began. This is what makes the Space Wolves dangerous. Not the aggression, which other chapters can match, not the combat prowess which other chapters can equal, the persistence, the absolute unwavering genetically reinforced refusal to stop until the work is done. They have been fighting for longer. The Space Wolves, the Vilka Fenriker, the Emperor's executioners, the most savage, the most loyal, the most stubbornly, infuriatingly, magnificently independent chapter in the Imperium of Man. Russ left the Space Wolves more than a chapter. He left them an identity. The Wolf King's personality, his values, his approach to warfare and to life are encoded in the chapter's culture as thoroughly as the Canis Helix is encoded in the chapter's gene seed. Every Space Wolf, from the newest Bloodclaw to the ancient Bjorn, carries Russ within them, not merely his genetic material but his character, his stubbornness, his loyalty, his aggression, his humour, and the combination of savagery and honour that the Wolf King embodied. The Imperium has changed in the 10 millennia since Russ walked the galaxy. The institutions have calcified. The faith has hardened into dogma. The purpose that the Emperor articulated during the Great Crusade has been buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and superstition that the Emperor would not recognise and that Russ would not tolerate. The Space Wolves have not changed. The chapter that Russ left behind is the same chapter that serves in the era Indomitus, its values unchanged, its culture intact, its commitment to the principles that Russ established undiminished by the passage of 10,000 years. The consistency is the Space Wolves' greatest strength and their greatest limitation. The strength is that the Space Wolves know who they are. In a universe of uncertainty, of shifting loyalties and eroding principles, the Space Wolves' identity is fixed, certain, unshakable. The limitation is that the Space Wolves cannot adapt their values to accommodate the realities of the modern Imperium, and the refusal to adapt produces the conflicts with the Imperium's institutions that have characterized the chapter's history since the heresies. Aftermath. The Space Wolves will not change. The Space Wolves cannot change. The Canis Helix is in their blood, and Russ is in their souls, and Fenris is in their bones, and the combination produces warriors who are, for better or worse, exactly what they were designed to be. The Emperor built them to be wolves. 10,000 years later, they are still wolves. The wolves are howling. Listen. Good night.